Hey guys, tonight we begin with Victorian England. So, dim the lights a little. Find a comfortable corner of your pillow. Pull the blanket up just enough to convince yourself you're definitely not getting out of bed again. Let your shoulders relax. Let the outside world keep doing whatever dramatic things it insists on doing. For the next little while, we're visiting a place that was somehow incredibly proper and unbelievably strange at exactly the same time. Because Victorian England has a reputation. People often imagine endless fog, black suits, polished manners, teacups, serious faces, and everyone speaking as though they were constantly attending the world's longest funeral. And yes, there was certainly plenty of that. But beneath the polished shoes and carefully combed sideburns was society that accepted some wonderfully odd habits as completely normal. Things that would make most modern people slowly lower their coffee mug and ask, "Wait, they actually did that?" The answer is usually yes. Tonight, we're going to drift through those customs together, not as a list of strange facts, but as if we're quietly walking through Victorian streets, peeking into drawing rooms, railway stations, royal palaces, cemeteries, schools, and comfortable middle-class homes where perfectly respectable people happily embraced ideas that seem wonderfully bizarre today. And the funny part is that none of them thought they were being unusual, because normal has a funny way of changing. Let's begin our slow walk. If you arrived in London sometime around the middle of Queen Victoria's reign, the first thing you might notice wasn't the buildings. It wasn't even Big Ben. It was a smell. Victorian London smelled like one enormous argument between coal smoke, horses, sewage, perfume, factories, river mud, damp stone, and about 1,000,000 fireplaces trying their very best. Fresh air was ambitious. The Industrial Revolution had transformed Britain into one of the world's greatest manufacturing powers, which was wonderful for economic growth, slightly less wonderful for lungs. Coal powered nearly everything. Homes, factories, steam engines. Even wealthier families expected smoke to drift across the city, like an extra layer of weather. Nobody questioned it very much. That was simply what progress smelled like. Of course, when your city permanently resembles someone forgot to open a chimney flue, people become surprisingly creative about personal hygiene, not always successfully. Contrary to popular belief, Victorians did bathe, just less frequently than modern people. Daily showers simply weren't practical for most households. Hot water had to be heated manually. Large bathtubs weren't universal. Running water was still becoming common. So washing often meant a basin, a cloth, and considerable optimism. Clean collars became almost more important than clean bodies. Fresh gloves, fresh cuffs, fresh hats. If your clothing looked respectable, people often assumed the rest of you probably was too. Fashion was performing quite a bit of heavy lifting. Perfume helped, cologne helped, flowers helped. Nothing entirely defeated the city's atmosphere, and everyone politely pretended not to notice. Victorian manners were remarkably skilled at pretending. If everyone ignored the awkward thing together, perhaps it would simply disappear. It rarely did. Speaking of pretending, let's gently wander into one of the greatest Victorian obsessions, respectability. Victorians absolutely adored appearing respectable, not necessarily being respectable. Appearing respectable, there's a subtle difference. A family could be quietly drowning in debt. The roof might leak. Dinner might consist of potatoes performing heroic service for the 5th consecutive evening. But if the curtains looked nice, if the silver was polished, if visitors believed everything was perfectly orderly, then social dignity remained intact. Image mattered enormously. Middle-class families in particular lived inside an elaborate performance. The father represented discipline. The mother represented virtue. Children represented future success. Servants represented status. Furniture represented taste. Books represented intelligence. Even if nobody actually read them, entire libraries could function almost like wallpaper, which, if we're honest, still occasionally happens today. Some things never entirely disappear. Now, one charmingly peculiar Victorian tradition involved photographs. Today we take thousands. Victorians treated photography almost like magic, because in many ways it was imagine living your whole life without ever seeing an accurate image of yourself, except perhaps a painted portrait that only wealthy people could afford. Then suddenly someone invents a machine capable of freezing reality forever. Extraordinary. Photography became treasured, expensive, special. Families dressed in their finest clothes, sat perfectly still, attempted serious expressions, not because they disliked smiling, mostly because early cameras required long exposure times. Holding a grin for 20 seconds starts to become surprisingly difficult, especially if someone tells you not to move. So everyone looked wonderfully solemn. Entire generations accidentally gained reputations for never smiling. Really, they were simply cooperating with 19th century technology. Technology, once again, making everyone slightly uncomfortable. Another custom surprises modern visitors even more. Post-mortem photography. Yes, families sometimes photograph loved ones after death. To modern eyes, this can appear unsettling. To Victorians, it was often deeply comforting. Remember, photography remained expensive. Many people never had portraits taken while alive. If a child died young, if a parent passed unexpectedly, the only photograph the family might ever possess became the final one. These images weren't intended as horror. They were remembrance, quiet memorials, one last family portrait, one final attempt to preserve someone who had already slipped into memory. Viewed through Victorian eyes, it becomes rather sad instead of strange. History often asks us to borrow another century's perspective, and that's one of the nicest parts of studying the past. People become easier to understand, even when their customs remain unusual. Let's slowly continue. Queen Victoria herself shaped much of the age. After her beloved husband, Prince Albert, died in 1861, she entered an extraordinarily long period of mourning. Years became decades. Black clothing became almost permanent. She withdrew from public appearances. She surrounded herself with reminders of Albert. His rooms remained carefully maintained. His clothes continued being laid out. Hot water was reportedly brought each morning, as though he might still need it. Grief settled gently over royal routine. The nation watched. Naturally, society followed. Victorian mourning became astonishingly elaborate. There were rules. Of course there were rules. Victorians loved rules almost as much as afternoon tea. Widows might wear black for years. Jewelry could contain woven hair from deceased relatives. Special mourning stationery existed. Specific fabrics. Specific etiquette. Specific expectations. Even the length of mourning depended upon who had died. Social life paused. Colors disappeared. Life slowed. Today, grief remains deeply personal. For many Victorians, it was also highly visible. Clothing quietly announced loss before a single word had been spoken. It became part of everyday life. Let's float gently into another curious corner of Victorian existence. Hair. Victorians had an extraordinary relationship with hair. They collected it, saved it, turned it into jewelry, made wreaths, created tiny works of art. Locks of hair became keepsakes exchanged between lovers. Parents preserved children's first curls. Families remembered the dead with carefully woven bracelets. To modern people, a bracelet made from someone's hair sounds, well, unexpected. To Victorians, it represented permanence. Hair lasts, long after almost everything else fades. It became memory you could hold. Strange? Certainly. Meaningful? Absolutely. Victorian homes themselves contained plenty of surprises. Drawing rooms displayed porcelain figures, heavy curtains, decorative plants, massive furniture, taxidermy. Yes, quite a lot of taxidermy. Animals appeared everywhere. Owls, foxes, birds, sometimes dressed in tiny costumes. Because apparently someone looked at a stuffed squirrel and thought, you know what this fellow needs? A waistcoat. Victorian taxidermists occasionally produced elaborate scenes featuring rabbits attending school, kittens drinking tea, frogs playing violins, tiny funerals for mice. No one seems entirely certain why the Victorians embraced these whimsical displays so enthusiastically. Perhaps long winters encouraged creativity. Perhaps people simply enjoyed combining science with imagination. Or perhaps every era develops one decorating trend that future generations politely decide not to repeat. The Victorians certainly earned theirs. Meanwhile, pets occupied an increasingly important place inside middle-class homes. Dogs slept indoors. Cats became companions. Birds sang inside elegant cages. Queen Victoria herself adored animals. Royal enthusiasm encouraged broader public affection, although Victorians occasionally loved animals while simultaneously collecting them. Human beings are wonderfully inconsistent. That inconsistency appears throughout history. People campaigned against cruelty, then happily hunted foxes on weekends. History rarely fits into tidy boxes. Instead, it wanders, much like our evening together. And speaking of wandering, let's take a slow stroll through a Victorian cemetery. Odd destination? Perhaps. Beautiful destination? Surprisingly, yes. Victorian cemeteries function almost like public parks. Families visited regularly. They picnicked, walked, read poetry, admired elaborate monuments. Before public parks became widespread, cemeteries offered peaceful green spaces, wide paths, trees, birdsong, quiet reflection. Children played, artists sketched, couples walked beneath ancient branches. Death existed alongside everyday life instead of being hidden away. The Victorians certainly respected mortality. They simply didn't avoid it. Modern culture often pushes death behind hospital doors. Victorian society invited it into conversation, not joyfully, simply honestly. After all, life was shorter. Disease remained common. Child mortality remained heartbreaking. Almost everyone experienced loss. Remembering became normal. Forgetting felt impossible. As evening settles over our imaginary Victorian walk, we'll pause here for now. We've only just stepped through the front gate of this remarkable century. Ahead of us still wait spiritual seances, mysterious medicines, impossible fashion, peculiar etiquette, impossible dining rules, railway adventures, children's games, curious beauty treatments, unusual health advice, eccentric inventions, and enough wonderfully ordinary oddities to fill many peaceful evenings. Because Victorian England was never simply proper. It was inventive, contradictory, heartfelt, anxious, optimistic, deeply sentimental, wonderfully complicated. And perhaps that's the nicest realization of all. The people living there never woke up believing they inhabited one of history's strangest societies. They simply made breakfast, straightened their collars, adjusted their hats, stepped into smoky streets, and carried on with lives that felt every bit as ordinary to them as ours feel to us. History has a gentle habit of reminding us that today's normal may become tomorrow's curiosity, and somewhere, perhaps 100 years from now, someone may be quietly drifting off to sleep while listening to a historian calmly explain why people in the early 21st century carried tiny glowing rectangles everywhere and voluntarily answered work emails while sitting on the sofa. Because why not double down on stress? When we left our gentle stroll through Victorian England, the streets were fading into evening. The lamps were beginning to glow through a haze of coal smoke. Horses were slowly pulling carriages over uneven cobblestones. And somewhere in the distance, a church bell reminded everyone that punctuality was practically a national hobby. So let's quietly continue. Take another slow breath. Imagine yourself turning down a side street lined with brick townhouses. Their windows are warmly lit. Lace curtains hide carefully arranged sitting rooms. Somewhere, someone is practicing the piano. Somewhere else, a kettle whistles. Nothing appears unusual, which is exactly how Victorian life liked to present itself, because beneath those tidy appearances were customs that modern visitors would find delightfully confusing. One of the first things you might notice upon entering a respectable Victorian home is that conversation followed an invisible rulebook. Nobody carried an actual handbook around, although, knowing the Victorians, someone probably published one. Etiquette governed almost everything. How to greet someone, how long to shake hands, how deeply to bow, which fork to use, how to introduce strangers, when to remove gloves, how to leave a dinner party without appearing eager to escape. Even writing letters became something of an art form. A poorly written letter could quietly damage a reputation. An overly enthusiastic letter might suggest poor upbringing. A letter that arrived too soon after another letter? Well, perhaps you were trying just a little too hard. Victorian society believed that proper behavior reflected proper character. If someone demonstrated perfect manners, people often assumed they possessed perfect morals. History, of course, gently reminds us that this wasn't always true. Very polite people can still make astonishingly poor decisions, and Victorian history supplies no shortage of examples. Still, everyone tried. Young ladies attended classes on deportment. Young gentlemen learned formal conversation. Children practiced sitting correctly, walking correctly, speaking correctly, even laughing correctly. Imagine being told there was an approved method for smiling. That sounds exhausting. And yet millions accepted it without complaint. Or perhaps they complained very quietly. Complaining loudly would have been terribly improper. Now let's drift into one of the Victorians' greatest passions. Tea. Yes, tea deserves its own peaceful stop along our journey. Britain certainly enjoyed tea before Queen Victoria. By her reign, however, tea had become something much larger than a drink. It was ritual, comfort, conversation, hospitality, routine. Entire afternoons revolved around it. A visitor arriving unexpectedly could almost always expect tea. Someone delivering good news? Tea. Bad news? Tea. Family gathering? Tea. Rain outside? Definitely tea. The answer to nearly every social situation involved placing a kettle on the fire. And to be fair, it's not the worst solution anyone has ever invented. Afternoon tea itself became especially fashionable among wealthier families. Small sandwiches, little cakes, biscuits, fresh bread, preserves, cream, elegant china, silver spoons polished until they reflected candlelight. It wasn't meant to replace dinner. It was simply designed to rescue people from the uncomfortable stretch between lunch and the evening meal. Apparently being slightly hungry at 4 o'clock required an entire cultural institution. The Victorians admired practical elegance. They preferred solving problems with lace tablecloths. Conversation during tea could be wonderfully indirect. If someone disliked another guest, they rarely announced it. Instead, they might compliment the weather while somehow making everyone understand they were deeply offended by Margaret's choice of curtains. Victorian communication often resembled polite fencing. Nobody swung wildly. Everyone made tiny, precise movements. Occasionally, someone suffered a devastating social defeat over pastry. Now, let's quietly leave the dining room and step into another curious Victorian obsession, the language of flowers. Today, flowers are lovely decorations. Victorians turned them into secret conversations. Entire books explain what each flower supposedly meant. A red rose represented love. Lilies suggested purity. Forget-me-nots asked exactly what their name implied. Yellow flowers could carry warnings. Some blossoms expressed gratitude. Others hinted at jealousy. A carefully arranged bouquet might communicate an entire paragraph without anyone speaking aloud. Imagine receiving flowers and immediately needing to consult a reference guide. Oh, 3 white carnations. What exactly is Harold trying to tell me? It sounds complicated, because it absolutely was. Still, the Victorians enjoyed hidden meanings. Open emotion sometimes felt uncomfortable. Symbolism offered a safer route. Instead of saying, "I miss you terribly," perhaps you simply delivered the appropriate flowers. Whether the recipient correctly decoded the botanical message, well, that depended upon how carefully they had studied their gardening manuals. Let's wander outside once again. Victorian streets were astonishingly busy, not with automobiles, with horses, thousands upon thousands of them. Every carriage, every omnibus, every delivery wagon, every cab, horse-powered. London alone housed enormous numbers of working horses. They hauled goods, pulled passengers, moved coal, delivered mail, worked from dawn until evening. People depended upon them completely, which also meant Victorian cities produced one unavoidable side effect: an incredible quantity of manure. History books often celebrate railways, factories, and engineering. Less frequently do they pause to mention what happened after 50,000 horses finished breakfast. Let's simply say sanitation, required constant attention. Street cleaners worked tirelessly. Rain occasionally helped. Strong noses became useful. Again, this simply counted as ordinary urban life. No one expected otherwise. The horse was as essential as electricity feels today. People adapted. Humans usually do. Speaking of transportation, railways transformed Victorian Britain. Imagine spending your entire life traveling at roughly the speed of a horse. Then suddenly steam locomotives appear. Distances shrink. Journeys accelerate. Cities connect. Markets expand. Families visit relatives hundreds of miles away. The modern world begins gathering speed. Early train travel thrilled people. It also frightened them. Some doctors even worried that moving at 30 or 40 miles per hour might damage the human body. Perhaps passengers wouldn't breathe properly. Perhaps organs might shift. Perhaps the brain would simply refuse to cooperate. Fortunately, humanity survived the terrifying experience of moderate speed. Although railway etiquette soon developed into another elaborate Victorian ritual. Ladies occupied separate compartments. Gentlemen removed hats. Conductors inspected tickets with impressive seriousness. Entire schedules revolved around punctuality. The railway became a symbol of order, provided nothing delayed it. And even then, the Victorians usually blamed the weather. Some traditions remain eternal. Now, let's gently visit a Victorian school. You may notice something immediately. Silence, or at least an enthusiastic attempt at silence. Education emphasized discipline almost as much as knowledge. Children sat upright. Hands remained visible. Lessons were memorized carefully. Recitation filled classrooms. Mistakes invited correction. Sometimes rather stern correction. Teachers commanded remarkable authority. Parents generally supported them. The idea that children should freely negotiate classroom rules would have puzzled most Victorians. Obedience ranked very highly indeed. Of course, children remained children. They whispered, they laughed, they daydreamed, they passed notes. Every generation invents creative ways to become distracted. Human nature rarely changes quite as much as technology does. Victorian toys reflected the era's craftsmanship, wooden trains, tin soldiers, dolls with porcelain faces, building blocks, skipping ropes, hoops rolled down streets. Board games gathered families around tables illuminated by gaslight. Without television or smartphones, evenings unfolded differently. People talked, read aloud, played music, sang together, performed little plays, solved puzzles, shared stories. It sounds remarkably peaceful. Although it's worth remembering there were also fewer alternatives. When entertainment required effort, people became surprisingly skilled at creating it. Let's float over to another wonderfully Victorian habit, collecting things. Victorians absolutely adored collections. Shells, butterflies, coins, minerals, books, pressed flowers, ancient pottery, bird eggs, foreign curiosities, fossils. Anything capable of fitting inside a cabinet eventually found itself carefully labeled and proudly displayed. The British Empire stretched across enormous portions of the globe. Travelers returned with fascinating objects from distant lands. Museums flourished. Private collections multiplied. Drawing rooms transformed into miniature exhibitions. Owning unusual objects suggested education, curiosity, refinement. Sometimes people collected so enthusiastically that they accumulated rooms filled almost entirely with fascinating clutter. Minimalism had not yet arrived. The Victorian decorating philosophy leaned gently toward, if one decorative vase is pleasant, perhaps 27 decorative vases would be magnificent. History occasionally embraces abundance with tremendous confidence, and perhaps no room demonstrated this more clearly than the Victorian parlor. Heavy curtains, patterned wallpaper, framed paintings, decorative clocks, carved tables, ornaments, photographs, plants, more ornaments, even more plants. Every available surface appeared determined to participate. The room felt full, comfortable, warm, perhaps just slightly overwhelmed. Yet visitors admired such spaces. A richly furnished home reflected prosperity. Empty rooms suggested unfinished lives. Today, many designers recommend removing unnecessary decorations. Victorians likely would have looked around those modern interiors and politely asked, "Did you forget to finish furnishing the house?" Different centuries, different priorities. And isn't that one of history's quiet joys? Every generation confidently believes it has discovered the correct way to arrange furniture. Eventually, another generation arrives, changes everything, then confidently declares a previous arrangement hopelessly outdated. The cycle continues. As our evening walk grows quieter, we find ourselves passing beneath rows of glowing gas lamps. Their gentle yellow light flickers against wet stone streets. Carriages roll slowly home. Shopkeepers lock their doors. Families gather around fireplaces. Somewhere a piano softly plays a familiar hymn. Somewhere else a father unfolds the evening newspaper while children finish homework beneath careful supervision. It feels calm, predictable, ordered. Yet beneath that orderly surface lies a society filled with wonderfully unusual assumptions. Flowers speak. Etiquette governs nearly every movement. Tea solves almost every inconvenience. Rooms overflow with collections. Railways inspire equal measures of excitement and anxiety. Children memorize diligently. Guests quietly judge wallpaper. And everyone somehow accepts these customs as perfectly ordinary, because ordinary is simply whatever surrounds us every day. The Victorians never considered themselves especially peculiar. Neither do we. Perhaps that's history's gentlest lesson. Every age becomes strange eventually. Every habit grows unfamiliar. Every certainty slowly transforms into curiosity. And as we continue wandering deeper into Victorian England next time, we'll discover seances attended by respectable families, medicines that were considerably more adventurous than modern pharmacists would recommend, beauty routines that require surprising bravery, and health advice delivered with complete confidence, despite occasionally being spectacularly mistaken. But for now, the lamps continue glowing softly through the London mist. The last train whistles somewhere beyond the rooftops. The kettle sings once more. Another cup of tea appears, and Victorian England quietly settles into another peaceful night, completely unaware that future generations will find its perfectly ordinary customs so wonderfully, comfortingly strange. The evening has grown quieter now. The last few carriages are making their way through London's misty streets. Gas lamps flicker softly against damp brick walls. Somewhere in the distance, a watchman calls the hour, his voice drifting through the cool night air. So settle in once again. If your pillow has somehow become even more comfortable than it was a few minutes ago, congratulations. You discovered one of life's greatest mysteries. Tonight, we're continuing our gentle walk through Victorian England, where perfectly sensible people believed in some remarkably unusual things. Not because they were foolish, because they were human. And humans have always been wonderfully good at believing that the present moment finally has everything figured out. History usually smiles politely and says, "Give it another 100 years." One of the most fascinating parts of Victorian life wasn't found in Parliament, or Buckingham Palace, or even inside the grand museums that were filling with treasures from around the globe. It was found around ordinary dining tables after sunset. This was the age of the seance. Today, if someone invited you over and casually mentioned they planned to communicate with great-grandfather after dessert, you might politely check whether they meant through old letters. Victorians often meant something considerably more direct. Spiritualism became enormously fashionable during the middle decades of the 19th century. Entire families gathered in darkened parlors. Candles were lit. Heavy curtains were drawn shut. Everyone sat quietly around a polished wooden table. Hands rested gently together. The room became silent. Then everyone waited. Sometimes the table supposedly moved. Sometimes mysterious knocking sounds echoed through the room. Sometimes messages appeared. Sometimes mediums claimed spirits wished to speak. The remarkable part wasn't that a few eccentric individuals believed these things. It was that respected doctors, lawyers, teachers, writers, even members of the aristocracy attended seances with genuine curiosity. Queen Victoria herself showed interest in spiritual matters after Prince Albert's death. Grief as a gentle way of making impossible ideas feel comforting. If there was even the smallest chance that loved ones still existed somewhere, many people wanted to believe. Can we really blame them? The 19th century was also an age of astonishing scientific discoveries. Telegraph suddenly allowed messages to travel hundreds of miles almost instantly. Invisible electricity powered remarkable inventions. X-rays would soon reveal bones hidden beneath skin. If invisible forces already surrounded everyday life, perhaps invisible spirits weren't such an outrageous possibility. From their perspective, the world kept becoming stranger every decade. Who was to say where the limits actually were? Of course, not everyone conducting seances was entirely honest. History politely introduces us to several enthusiastic mediums whose supernatural talents mysteriously disappeared whenever skeptical investigators entered the room. Funny how that worked. Tables stopped floating. Ghosts became unusually shy. Spirit trumpets lost their enthusiasm. Apparently, the afterlife had a complicated relationship with proper lighting. Still, even when fraud appeared, belief often remained. Because people weren't only searching for ghosts. They were searching for comfort. And comfort has always been one of humanity's favorite inventions. Let's quietly leave the seance room before anything starts knocking on the furniture. Instead, we'll visit somewhere equally fascinating, a Victorian pharmacy. Now, if you've ever complained about reading the side effects listed on modern medicine bottles, Victorian medicine would probably encourage some perspective. Medical science was improving rapidly. Doctors genuinely wanted to help. Hospitals gradually became cleaner. Surgery slowly became safer. Understanding of disease steadily improved. But many treatments still seem rather adventurous today. One particularly famous remedy contained opium. Quite a lot of it. Children cried, a soothing syrup. Couldn't sleep, another syrup. Persistent cough, more syrup. Nervousness, believe it or not, probably another syrup. Many medicines contained ingredients we would never casually hand out today. Some included cocaine. Others relied heavily upon alcohol. Patent medicine manufacturers made astonishing claims. One bottle supposedly cured headaches. Another promised stronger digestion. Another claimed to improve memory. Another promised healthier lungs. One optimistic tonic practically implied it could improve your entire personality. Advertising has always possessed remarkable confidence. Doctors gradually became more skeptical. Scientists demanded evidence. Slowly, medicine shifted away from hopeful guessing toward careful testing. Thankfully, because history occasionally reminds us that confidence and correctness are not always close friends. Now, let's step into another ordinary Victorian household. You may notice that nearly every window is covered. Heavy curtains, lace drapes, decorative fabric. Privacy mattered. The home represented a sanctuary from increasingly crowded industrial cities. Outside felt noisy, busy, competitive. Inside was expected to feel calm, ordered, moral. Middle-class homes almost became tiny kingdoms ruled by routine. Breakfast happened at proper times. Dinner followed established customs. Visitors arrived according to etiquette. Children behaved respectfully. Servants quietly kept everything functioning. At least that was the ideal. Reality, naturally, remained considerably messier. Children still spill things. Dogs still chase cats. Guests occasionally stayed far too long. Even the most respectable families argued over completely ordinary matters. History has a comforting way of revealing that no generation ever truly escaped family life. Now, speaking of servants, Victorian Britain employed enormous numbers of domestic servants. In fact, domestic service became one of the most common occupations available to women. Large houses functioned almost like small businesses. Housekeepers, cooks, maids, footmen, gardeners, coachmen, laundry workers, nannies, butlers, each performed specific responsibilities. A wealthy household might include dozens of employees working quietly behind the scenes. Interestingly, many family members rarely entered servant areas. Separate staircases existed, separate hallways, separate dining rooms. Entire sections of large houses remained almost invisible to visitors. The elegant drawing room upstairs depended completely upon hard-working people downstairs. Their work allowed respectable society to appear effortlessly graceful. Of course, it wasn't effortless. Someone polished every silver spoon. Someone cleaned every fireplace. Someone carried endless buckets of hot water. Someone ironed enormous quantities of clothing. Victorian elegance required astonishing amounts of labor, much of it unseen. History often works like that. The visible part rests upon countless invisible efforts. Let's quietly climb another staircase, this time into a Victorian bedroom. You may notice something curious beside the bed, a chamber pot. Indoor plumbing existed in some places, not everywhere. Many families still relied upon chamber pots during the night. Morning routines involved discreet emptying, not glamorous, entirely practical. Again, perfectly ordinary. The Victorians accepted inconveniences that would frustrate many modern people. Lighting depended on candles or gas. Heating required fireplaces. Laundry consumed entire days. Bathing demanded preparation. Letters traveled slowly. Information moved at the speed of trains. Yet people rarely described themselves as deprived. They simply lived according to the possibilities available. Humans are surprisingly adaptable creatures. Every era feels normal while you're inside it. Now, let's turn our attention toward fashion. Victorian clothing was undeniably elegant. It was also remarkably complicated. Gentlemen wore waistcoats, pocket watches, collars, cravats, jackets, trousers, polished boots. Ladies often wore dresses consisting of multiple layers, undergarments, corsets, bustles, petticoats, gloves, hats, parasols. Fashion could require considerable engineering. Getting dressed wasn't something accomplished in 5 hurried minutes. It was practically a project. Corsets, in particular, have become famous. Modern stories sometimes exaggerate how tightly every woman laced them. Not everyone aimed for impossible waistlines. Many corsets simply provided support, rather like structured undergarments today. Still, fashion occasionally encouraged uncomfortable extremes, because humans have always demonstrated an impressive willingness to sacrifice comfort for appearance. High heels, neckties, tight suits, designer handbags. Victorians certainly weren't alone in that department. Some traditions simply changed their wardrobe. Speaking of appearances, pale skin remained fashionable. Unlike today, where many people seek sun-kissed complexions, Victorian beauty often emphasized fairness. A pale face suggested that someone didn't labor outdoors all day. It quietly signaled wealth, status, leisure. Ladies carried parasols, wide-brimmed hats, gloves, anything that reduced sun exposure. Beauty standards have always wandered in fascinating directions. Sometimes they reverse completely. The same skin tone admired in one century becomes unfashionable in another. History rarely follows straight lines. Let's drift into another uniquely Victorian obsession. Reading. Books flourished. Newspapers multiplied. Magazines appeared in astonishing variety. The expanding middle class eagerly consumed literature. Charles Dickens became a household name. Arthur Conan Doyle introduced Sherlock Holmes. Poetry filled parlors. Novels circulated among friends. Families often read aloud together during the evening. Imagine an entire household gathering around the fireplace, while one person slowly read chapters from a novel. No television, no streaming services, just voices, imagination, patience. Stories unfolded over weeks, perhaps months. There was something wonderfully unhurried about it. Books themselves became treasured possessions. Beautiful bindings, gold lettering, decorated covers. Private libraries reflected education and refinement. Even households of modest means often made room for books whenever possible. Knowledge carried prestige. Reading suggested ambition, curiosity, character. The Victorians genuinely believed books could improve people. They weren't always wrong. As our evening walk continues, we've now seen respectable families attempting to contact spirits, pharmacies selling astonishingly optimistic remedies, elegant homes supported by armies of unseen servants. bedrooms without modern plumbing, wardrobes that required remarkable patience, and living rooms where entire families quietly disappeared into novels by candlelight. None of these things felt extraordinary. They simply belonged to everyday life. That is perhaps history's greatest trick. It quietly reminds us that ordinary people have always lived inside worlds that future generations would find astonishing. The Victorians would almost certainly be amazed that many of us carry libraries, cameras, maps, clocks, newspapers, music players, and instant communication devices all inside one small object we casually keep in our pockets. They might find us just as peculiar as we find them, and perhaps they would smile politely before offering us another cup of tea. In our next peaceful evening together, we'll explore Victorian beauty treatments that required surprising courage, dinner parties governed by invisible rules, the peculiar popularity of keeping exotic pets, curious Christmas traditions, and why respectable people became fascinated with Egypt, mummies, and collecting things from ancient civilizations. For now, though, the candles burn a little lower. The coal fire crackles softly. Outside, London streets grow quiet beneath the night sky. Another Victorian family finishes their evening prayers. The fire has burned a little lower now. The coals glow with that quiet orange light that seems to belong only to old fireplaces. Outside, the streets are calmer than they were an hour ago. The occasional horse and carriage still rolls over the cobblestones, but the city has settled into a slower rhythm. It's a kind of evening where even London seems to yawn. So make yourself comfortable once again. Tonight we're going to continue wandering through Victorian England, where people somehow managed to combine incredible scientific progress with beliefs and habits that could leave modern visitors blinking in complete confusion. Not because they lacked intelligence. Quite the opposite. The Victorians were among the most educated generations Britain had ever produced. They simply viewed the world through a different window. And every generation has its own window. Let's begin with beauty. Human beings have always wanted to look just a little healthier, a little younger, a little more fashionable than everyone else. The Victorians were certainly no exception. If anything, they approached beauty with tremendous dedication. Sometimes, a little too much dedication. Take complexion, for example. As we mentioned before, pale skin represented elegance. It suggested that someone didn't spend long hours working under the sun. A fair complexion hinted at wealth, comfort, respectability. Naturally, people searched for ways to appear even paler. Some simply stayed indoors. Others carried parasols whenever sunlight appeared. Large hats became fashionable. Light powders covered the face. Most of these methods were perfectly harmless. Others, well, history occasionally reminds us that cosmetics once involved considerably more courage than they do today. Certain beauty creams contain ingredients we now recognize as toxic. Lead appeared in cosmetics for centuries. Mercury found its way into various skin treatments. The irony is almost gentle. People wanted healthier-looking skin. Some products quietly damaged the very thing they promised to improve. Advertising rarely mentioned that part. Advertising still has a remarkable talent for emphasizing the positive. Victorian newspapers overflowed with promises. Hair tonics, miracle soaps, special creams, secret formulas, guaranteed improvements. A bottle claiming to restore youthful beauty could become surprisingly popular, even if its greatest achievement was making someone's wallet noticeably lighter. Some things truly never change. Hair itself received enormous attention. Gentlemen carefully groomed impressive beards, magnificent mustaches, neatly trimmed whiskers. Facial hair became something of a national pastime. The larger and more carefully maintained the beard, the more distinguished a gentleman might appear. Of course, maintaining one required patience. Special brushes, combs, oils, waxes. Entire businesses appeared to serve Britain's growing forest of facial hair. Looking respectable took work. Meanwhile, ladies spent remarkable amounts of time arranging hairstyles that balanced elegance with practicality. Hairpins, braids, curls, decorative combs, ribbons, flowers. Every style quietly reflected changing fashions. Photographs from the period reveal astonishing creativity. No two decades looked exactly alike. Fashion never sits still for very long. Now, Let's quietly step into the dining room of an upper-middle-class Victorian family. Dinner is about to begin. The table gleams beneath gaslight. Silver cutlery catches the warm glow. Crystal glasses sparkle. Everything appears beautifully arranged. Nothing feels accidental, because almost nothing is. Victorian dinner etiquette could feel like navigating a pleasant maze. There were rules about seating, rules about serving, rules about conversation, rules about soup. Yes, even soup. Imagine arriving for dinner. You find your place. Then you notice 3 forks, 2 knives, several spoons, multiple glasses, a folded napkin resembling complicated architecture. You quietly hope someone else starts eating first. Fortunately, that strategy has worked for dinner guests across several centuries. Conversation itself followed careful expectations. Politics? Often risky. Money? Best avoided. Religion? Proceed with caution. Scandal? Only if discussed politely. Guests aim to appear educated without seeming boastful. Witty without dominating. Interesting without becoming controversial. It required balance. Victorian society admired self-control almost above everything else. Strong emotion stayed carefully wrapped. One did not dramatically leap from the chair during dessert. One certainly did not shout. Even disagreement wore polished shoes. Of course, human beings remained human. Arguments still happened. Families still disagreed. Someone occasionally overcooked the roast. Children still giggled at unfortunate moments. The perfect Victorian household existed mostly inside etiquette books. Real life remained delightfully imperfect. Now, let's move from the dining table to the family sitting room after dinner. This was often the heart of evening life. Someone might play the piano. Another family member sang. Perhaps father read the newspaper aloud. Mother worked on embroidery. Children practiced handwriting. Guests joined card games. Books passed quietly from one reader to another, without radio, without television, without internet. Entertainment usually required participation. You couldn't simply watch. You became part of it. Entire evenings revolved around conversation, storytelling, music, games. Even charades became enormously popular. Imagine an entire room full of respectable adults enthusiastically pretending to be windmills or famous generals while everyone else attempted to guess. History has a wonderful way of reminding us that adults have always enjoyed being slightly ridiculous. They simply preferred doing it with excellent manners. Speaking of entertainment, let's visit the theater. Victorian theaters were bustling places, crowded, lively, sometimes surprisingly noisy. Audiences didn't always sit in silent admiration. They reacted. They applauded loudly. They laughed. They chatted during performances. Some even brought food. Performers expected interaction. A successful actor could become a national celebrity. People collected portraits of famous performers, purchased souvenirs, discussed dramatic performances over tea the following afternoon. The Victorian age adored respectable entertainment. It also adored spectacular entertainment, magic shows, circuses, traveling exhibitions, mechanical inventions. Human curiosity happily embraced almost anything new, which brings us to one of the century's greatest obsessions, the Great Exhibition of 1851. Imagine entering an enormous glass building unlike anything the world had ever seen. The Crystal Palace stretched before visitors like something from a dream. Glass, iron, sunlight, thousands upon thousands of exhibits, machines, furniture, scientific instruments, textiles, works of art, objects from across the British Empire. People wandered through enormous halls in amazement. Steam engines stood beside delicate sculptures. Industrial machinery shared space with beautiful craftsmanship. It represented Victorian confidence at its absolute peak. The future seemed limitless. Technology promised endless progress. Every invention suggested another breakthrough waiting just around the corner. Looking back, it's touching. Every generation believes it stands at the edge of tomorrow. Usually, it's correct, just not in quite the way it expects. Now, let's quietly leave London for the countryside. The Victorian countryside remained slower, greener, calmer. Villages clustered around ancient churches. Stone cottages lined narrow roads. Farmers still depended upon seasons much as their ancestors had done. Life followed familiar rhythms. Planting, harvest, market days, church on Sunday, village fairs. Children chased one another across open fields. Dogs barked. Church bells echoed over rolling hills. Yet even here, change slowly arrived. Railways connected rural communities. Newspapers carried news from distant cities. Manufactured goods appeared in village shops. The Industrial Revolution reached even places that seemed untouched. Victorian Britain became increasingly connected. The world felt a little smaller each decade. Now, let's return indoors, this time to a nursery. Victorian ideas about childhood were changing dramatically. Earlier centuries often viewed children as simply very small adults. The Victorians increasingly saw childhood as a unique stage deserving protection. Books specifically for children became popular. Nursery rhymes flourished. Illustrated storybooks appeared. Toy makers expanded their businesses. Christmas gift became increasingly important. Middle-class parents invested more attention in education, health, moral development, family photographs. Children occupied a special emotional place within the household. Of course, not every child enjoyed the same experience. Many poor children still worked. Factories, mines, workshops, street vending. History rarely moves forward evenly. While one family read bedtime stories beside a comfortable fireplace, another struggled simply to afford dinner. Victorian Britain contained extraordinary wealth. It also contained heartbreaking poverty. The contrast existed almost street by street. One elegant neighborhood could stand surprisingly close to overcrowded slums. Charles Dickens described these contrasts vividly because he saw them with his own eyes. Progress, it turns out, rarely arrives for everyone at exactly the same moment. Now let's drift toward one of the Victorians' more unusual fascinations. Ancient Egypt. Europe had admired Egypt for centuries. But the 19th century developed something approaching an obsession. Mummies fascinated people. Hieroglyphs, pyramids, golden artifacts, ancient temples. Travelers returned with remarkable discoveries. Museums eagerly displayed them. Collectors proudly purchased Egyptian objects. Some wealthy individuals even hosted mummy unwrapping parties. Yes, exactly what it sounds like. Guests gathered to watch ancient mummies carefully unwrapped for entertainment and curiosity. Today, such events feel deeply disrespectful. Modern archaeology emphasizes preservation and cultural respect. Victorians approached the past rather differently. To them, ancient Egypt represented mystery, adventure, discovery, scientific excitement. Many genuinely believed they were expanding knowledge, even if their methods occasionally leave modern historians quietly covering their faces. History teaches us, then asks us to do a little better. Fortunately, we usually try. As midnight approaches on our imaginary Victorian evening, one final custom deserves our attention: letter writing. Victorians wrote letters constantly. Friends, family, business partners, sweethearts, travelers. Nearly every relationship relied upon handwritten correspondence. The arrival of the Morning Post became an event. Several deliveries could occur each day in London. People eagerly awaited news, birth announcements, invitations, condolences, business agreements, love letters. Every envelope carried possibility. Penmanship mattered, grammar mattered, paper quality mattered. Even sealing wax could quietly reveal social standing. Today we exchange messages in seconds. Victorian letters sometimes travel for days, perhaps weeks. Yet people often compose them with extraordinary care. Each sentence reflected thought. Each page represented time. There's something quietly beautiful about that slower pace. Not necessarily better, simply different. And different is exactly why we enjoy wandering through history together. Tonight, we watch respectable ladies apply questionable beauty treatments. Gentlemen carefully groom impressive beards. Families navigate invisible dinner rules. Children gather around piano music. Visitors marvel beneath the crystal palace. Collectors become fascinated with ancient Egypt. Friends patiently wait for handwritten letters. Every scene has felt perfectly ordinary to the people living it. That's the gentle magic of history. Nobody wakes up believing they belong to a fascinating historical era. They simply wake up, brush their hair, drink their tea, worry about tomorrow, smile at friends, complain about the weather, and carry on. Only later do future generations look back and whisper, "What an extraordinary world." In the next part of our peaceful journey, we'll step into the wonderfully peculiar world of Victorian Christmas traditions, exotic household pets, curious medical beliefs, seaside holidays, unusual hobbies, and the everyday routines that quietly shape millions of lives beneath Queen Victoria's remarkably long reign. For now, the house has gone still. The candles are nearly out. The fire gives one last soft crackle. Outside, the London fog wraps itself gently around the sleeping city. The night has become wonderfully quiet. The last carriage has disappeared around the corner, leaving only the distant clip-clop of horses somewhere beyond the fog. The gas lamps continue their patient work, painting little pools of golden light onto wet cobblestones. Most homes have drawn their curtains. Most fireplaces have settled into glowing embers. It feels like the perfect time to continue. So relax your shoulders once more. There's nowhere to rush. The Victorians certainly weren't. Well, unless they were trying to catch a train. Everything else moved at a pace that modern life has almost forgotten. Tonight, we'll wander to the quieter pleasures of Victorian England, holidays, hobbies, pets, seaside vacations, and those wonderfully ordinary routines that fill the spaces between history's bigger events. Because history isn't only made by queens and prime ministers. It's also made by people deciding what to do on a Tuesday afternoon. One of the nicest surprises awaiting a visitor to Victorian England would probably be Christmas. Today it's difficult to imagine Christmas without decorated trees, twinkling lights, greeting cards, gift exchanges, family dinners, and far too many biscuits. But many of the traditions we now consider completely normal became enormously popular during Queen Victoria's reign. Ironically, one of Britain's favorite Christmas traditions arrived from Germany. Prince Albert brought with him the custom of decorating Christmas trees. At first, many Britons found the idea charmingly unusual. A tree inside the house? Decorated? Intentionally? Interesting. Then newspapers published illustrations of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert standing beside their decorated tree with their children. Almost immediately, fashionable families decided this looked like an excellent idea. Royal influence worked remarkably well. If the Queen decorated a tree, perhaps everyone should. Soon Christmas trees appeared throughout middle-class homes. Candles were clipped carefully onto branches. Tiny handmade ornaments sparkled in firelight. Ribbons, small toys, fruit, sweet treats. Simple decorations by modern standards, yet magical for families seeing such displays for the first time. One detail deserves mentioning. Real candles, attached to dry evergreen branches. It's a charming tradition. Also a wonderfully enthusiastic invitation for accidental excitement. Fortunately, someone usually remained nearby with careful eyes. Christmas cards also exploded in popularity. Advances in printing made colorful greeting cards increasingly affordable. Suddenly, families could send cheerful messages across the country. Artists created snowy landscapes, robins, holly, children, angels, friendly greetings. Some Victorian Christmas cards, however, were gloriously strange. Modern cards usually feature cozy fireplaces. Victorian cards occasionally displayed frogs playing violins, fighting insects, cheerful vegetables, cats wearing boots, dead birds. No one seems entirely certain why. Perhaps artists simply enjoyed surprising people, or perhaps Victorian humor wandered down wonderfully unexpected paths. Whatever the explanation, some holiday cards looked as though someone had fallen asleep halfway through a perfectly sensible idea. And honestly, that makes them rather memorable. Now, let's quietly step into another favorite Victorian pastime, collecting pets. Not just ordinary pets, unusual pets. Britain's expanding empire brought fascinating animals from across the globe. Parrots became fashionable. Monkeys occasionally appeared in wealthy households. Tortoises wandered through gardens. Hedgehogs found comfortable homes. Exotic birds fascinated collectors. Even tiny squirrels sometimes became indoor companions. Imagine visiting your respectable Victorian aunt. You're expecting tea, perhaps cake. Instead, a monkey politely observes the conversation from the curtains. No one seems particularly alarmed. Apparently, this is simply Frederick. He enjoys raisins. History occasionally presents these moments with complete confidence. The Victorians had an enormous curiosity about the natural world. Zoos expanded. Private menageries appeared. Natural history museums flourished. People genuinely wanted to understand animals better. Sometimes they also wanted one sitting beside the fireplace. Cats enjoyed increasing popularity throughout the century. Earlier generations often valued cats primarily for catching mice. Victorians gradually began appreciating them simply for being cats. Independent, elegant, occasionally ignoring everyone. Some traditions never change. Dogs likewise became beloved family companions. Certain breeds became particularly fashionable among the upper classes. Dog shows emerged. Pedigrees gained importance. People discussed breeding with tremendous seriousness. Some gentlemen could happily spend an entire evening debating spaniels. Others preferred terriers. One imagines these conversations becoming surprisingly passionate, politely passionate. This was still Victorian England. Now let's leave the city altogether. The railway has made travel easier than ever before. We're heading toward the seaside. Victorian Britain absolutely adored seaside holidays. Fresh sea air was believed to improve nearly everything. Weak lungs? Visit the coast. Feeling tired? Sea air. Children seem pale? Definitely sea air. Doctors frequently recommended coastal vacations. Whether the sea actually cured every complaint remained open to discussion, but it certainly offered cleaner air than industrial London. Families flocked to places like Brighton, Blackpool, Scarborough, and Eastbourne. Railways made these trips increasingly affordable. Entire stations filled with excited holidaymakers carrying trunks, picnic baskets, and enough hats to survive several weather systems. British weather, after all, enjoys variety. Sometimes within the same afternoon, upon reaching the beach, visitors participated in a wonderfully curious custom. Bathing machines. Picture a small wooden hut built on wheels. People entered fully dressed, changed into bathing clothes inside. The entire hut was then pulled into the sea by horses. Once the water reached an appropriate depth, bathers stepped discreetly into the ocean. Privacy remained wonderfully intact. Modesty survived. Everyone was satisfied. It seems like an astonishing amount of effort merely to go swimming. Yet to Victorians, it represented civilized organization, which was generally their preferred solution to almost everything. Organize it, label it, write rules for it, then perhaps create a committee. Not uniquely Victorian. Now, let's wander through a pleasant public park. Victorian parks multiplied throughout growing cities. Urban planners recognized that crowded industrial neighborhoods needed open green spaces. Families strolled beneath carefully planted trees. Children sailed little wooden boats across ponds. Bands performed music in elegant gazebos. Couples walked slowly along winding paths. Respectable conversation flourished. People watched other people. And perhaps just a tiny bit more importantly, people allowed other people to watch them. A leisurely walk became a social performance. Your clothing, your manners, your companions. Everything quietly communicated something. Public parks functioned almost like outdoor drawing rooms, except with considerably more ducks. The Victorians appreciated ducks. They appreciated almost anything that appeared orderly. Flower beds displayed geometric precision. Gravel paths remained carefully maintained. Gardeners trimmed hedges with remarkable patience. Nature received a gentle helping hand. Wild landscapes looked beautiful. Organized landscapes looked respectable. Speaking of respectable hobbies, gardening became enormously popular. Victorians loved plants. Houseplants, garden plants, rare plants, imported plants, plants climbing walls, plants filling conservatories, plants occupying every available windowsill. The discovery of exotic species from around the world fueled tremendous excitement. orchids became particularly fashionable. Collectors searched tirelessly for rare varieties. Plant hunters traveled incredible distances, sometimes risking their lives to bring unusual flowers back to Britain. Imagine explaining that career to someone. So what exactly do you do? I climb mountains looking for unusually attractive orchids. Oh, naturally. The Victorian love of gardening reflected something deeper. Industrial cities expanded rapidly. Factories multiplied. Smoke darkened skies. Perhaps tending flowers offered a peaceful balance. A small reminder that beauty continued growing despite everything else. Now, let's quietly peek inside a gentleman's study. Books line the shelves. Maps cover one wall. A globe stands proudly in the corner. There are drawers filled with stamps. Coins. Butterflies. Press leaves. Interesting rocks. Perhaps even fossils. Victorian hobbies often revolved around learning. Amateur scientists flourished. People observed birds, recorded weather, collected insects, studied astronomy, examined fossils. Science wasn't confined entirely to universities. Ordinary people enthusiastically participated. Natural history societies welcomed members. Lectures attracted audiences. Curiosity became fashionable. There is something wonderfully encouraging about that. The 19th century genuinely celebrated learning. Knowledge itself carried social value. You didn't always need to become a professional scientist. Simply being interested counted for something. Perhaps that's a tradition worth preserving. As the evening grows later, let's pause beside a familiar sight. A grandfather clock quietly marks another passing hour. Somewhere upstairs, children have long since gone to bed. Downstairs, adults continue reading beside the fire. The household cat stretches comfortably on the rug. A kettle gently hums once again. Tea appears almost by magic. It usually does in Victorian England. Looking back across this peaceful evening, we've celebrated Christmas beneath candlelit trees, met respectable families, keeping delightfully unusual pets, visited cheerful seaside, resorts complete with horse-drawn bathing machines, strolled through carefully designed parks, admired magnificent gardens, shared the quiet curiosity of amateur naturalists. None of these activities made newspaper headlines. None changed the course of empires. Yet together they formed everyday life. And everyday life is where history truly lives. Kings sign treaties. Generals fight battles. Politicians deliver speeches. But ordinary people decorate Christmas trees, walk dogs, plant flowers, write letters, take holidays, drink tea, read novels before bed. Those simple moments quietly shape entire generations. Perhaps that's why studying the past feels comforting. We discover that people separated from us by nearly 2 centuries still worried about the weather, still spoiled their pets, still looked forward to holidays, still searched for hobbies, still wanted their homes to feel warm and welcoming. Technology changes, fashion changes. Even Christmas cards occasionally become much less interested in aggressively cheerful frogs. But people remain reassuringly familiar. In the next part of our slow journey, we'll explore Victorian shopping, department stores, advertisements, superstitions, public celebrations, curious inventions, and the everyday routines that made Britain feel increasingly modern while still holding tightly to centuries-old traditions. For now, the seaside waves roll gently against the shore. The gardens fall silent beneath the moonlight. London sleeps beneath its blanket of coal smoke and mist. And somewhere in a quiet Victorian home, a Christmas tree glows softly beside the fireplace, while Frederick the monkey very likely steals one more raisin before everyone notices. The house is completely still now. Only the grandfather clock continues its steady work, patiently counting moments that no one can ever collect again. Outside, the fog has settled low over London streets. A lone police constable walks his route beneath the soft glow of gas lamps, occasionally tapping his truncheon against the pavement, more as reassurance than necessity. Somewhere, a bakery has already begun preparing tomorrow morning's bread. The city never truly sleeps. It simply whispers instead of talking. So settle in once more. Tonight, we'll continue our slow journey through Victorian England by wandering to places that every ordinary Victorian knew well, Shops, department stores, advertisements, fairs, superstitions, and the curious excitement of living in a century that seemed to invent something new every other Tuesday. Imagine that it is Saturday morning. You put on your best clothes. Your boots are polished. Your hat sits properly. You're heading into town to go shopping. Now, shopping in Victorian England wasn't quite the leisurely activity it often is today. For many people, it was still a practical necessity. You visited the butcher for meat, the baker for bread, the greengrocer for vegetables, the fishmonger for fish, the tailor for clothing, the chemist for medicine. Every specialty had its own shop. Every shopkeeper usually knew most of the neighborhood by name. Buying groceries often included conversation, not because anyone was in a hurry. Quite the opposite. Time moved differently. The butcher might ask about your family. The baker might mention tomorrow's weather. The postmaster probably knew everyone's business before anyone else did. Quite unintentionally, of course. Probably. Small communities have always shared information with remarkable efficiency. Long before social media existed, there was simply Mrs. Thompson across the street. She somehow knew everything. History suggests that every neighborhood has always had one. Then something remarkable began happening during Queen Victoria's reign. Department stores appeared. For modern shoppers, this sounds perfectly ordinary. For Victorians, it felt revolutionary. Instead of visiting 10 different shops, people could enter one enormous building filled with almost everything imaginable. Clothing, furniture, toys, books, perfume, kitchen utensils, jewelry, umbrellas, gloves, tea sets, curtains, candles, and probably at least 3 things you never intended to buy. Some experiences never change. One of the most famous department stores became Harrods. Walking through its doors must have felt astonishing. Bright displays, beautiful glass cases, neatly arranged merchandise, friendly assistants, elegant surroundings. Shopping itself slowly transformed into entertainment. Families visited simply to admire the displays. Window shopping became an activity. Imagine explaining that phrase to someone from the 17th century. So, you walk around looking at things you aren't planning to buy? Exactly. And you enjoy this? Very much. Human beings are wonderfully curious creatures. Advertisements also became increasingly sophisticated. Victorian newspapers overflowed with announcements. Every page seemed convinced that one more product will improve your life forever. Hair restorers, digestive tonics, improved corsets, remarkable soap, superior umbrellas, pens guaranteed to improve handwriting, special biscuits claiming extraordinary nutritional value. One enthusiastic advertisement might promise to strengthen your constitution. Another guaranteed improved sleep. Another confidently suggested that its product had been personally approved by doctors, or explorers, or perhaps someone vaguely connected to the royal family. Advertising has always enjoyed borrowing impressive names. Whether those impressive people actually approved anything, well, sometimes the details became a little fuzzy. Still, advertisements reflected genuine optimism. Victorian Britain believed deeply in progress. If someone invented a better toothbrush, wonderful. A more reliable sewing machine, even better. An improved railway brake, excellent. The century-celebrated invention, almost like a national sport. And inventions kept arriving. The sewing machine transformed clothing production. The typewriter changed offices. Improved printing presses spread information faster than ever before. The telephone eventually appeared. Imagine hearing about the telephone for the first time. A machine that lets you hear someone's voice. From another building? Precisely. Without them actually being here. Yes. Victorians experienced technological surprises that must have felt almost magical. Every decade seemed impossible compared to one before. Some older citizens spent their childhood traveling by horse and candlelight, then lived long enough to witness electric lighting, telephones, and moving pictures. What an astonishing lifetime that must have been. No wonder so many people believed they were living in the most exciting age in history. Perhaps they were. Let's quietly leave the shops behind and wander toward the town square. A fair has arrived. Victorian fairs combined old traditions with modern attractions. There were merry-go-rounds, food stalls, musicians, punch and Judy puppet shows, acrobats, strongmen, magicians, mechanical exhibits, fortune tellers. Children ran excitedly between colorful tents. Parents pretended not to be equally curious. The Victorians loved education, but they also loved being entertained. Those two ideas often happily shook hands. A traveling exhibition might feature remarkable inventions. Another displayed unusual animals. Another demonstrated scientific experiments. Someone might lecture about astronomy. Next door, another gentleman attempted to swallow swords. Victorian entertainment possessed impressive range. One minute, you were learning about geology. The next, someone was balancing on a horse while juggling flaming torches. Life was wonderfully unpredictable. Now, let's step quietly into another ordinary Victorian belief: superstition. For all their scientific achievements, Victorians remained surprisingly superstitious. Many people avoided walking beneath ladders. Breaking mirrors still caused concern. Lucky charms remained popular. People carried small tokens for protection. Certain days felt luckier than others. Even educated families occasionally followed traditions inherited from grandparents. Science advanced rapidly. Old beliefs simply walked beside it. By now, stations had become miniature cities. Porters hurried across platforms pushing luggage carts. Conductors called departure times. Steam drifted beneath enormous iron roofs. Newspapers were sold by energetic boys weaving through crowds. Ladies carefully gathered long dresses before stepping aboard. Gentlemen checked pocket watches approximately every 12 seconds. The Victorians absolutely adored punctuality. Railways almost required it. Before standardized railway time, different towns often kept slightly different local times. Imagine the confusion. Your watch says noon. The next town insists it's 12 minutes later. Train schedules begin looking rather complicated. Eventually, Britain largely adopted standardized time. The railways quietly taught an entire nation to synchronize its clocks. It's one of those historical details that seems small, yet it changed everyday life forever. Now, everyone agreed what 3 o'clock actually meant. Progress sometimes arrives disguised as better organization. Speaking of organization, let's visit the Victorian office. Rows of desks, ledgers, ink bottles, stacks of paperwork, pens scratching across thick paper. No computers, no photocopiers. Every letter written by hand. Every calculation completed manually. Clerks developed beautiful handwriting because they had little choice. Mistakes required patience. A spilled bottle of ink could ruin an entire afternoon. Office life demanded precision. It also demanded astonishingly neat penmanship. Today we complain when computers briefly freeze. Victorian clerks probably would have smiled kindly, then handed us another bottle of ink. Let's gently move into another growing part of Victorian life: photography studios. We've already discussed portraits, but visiting a photographer became an event in itself. Families dressed carefully. Children were reminded, repeatedly, to sit still, very still, perhaps even stiller. Long exposure times required remarkable patience. Photographers use hidden supports behind chairs to help people remain motionless. Babies occasionally refused to cooperate, quite understandably. Some mothers even hid beneath blankets while secretly holding infants upright during photographs. The finished image often revealed only the child. Mother had effectively become furniture. History occasionally produces delightful solutions to technical limitations. Now let's wander into a bookstore. The smell greets you immediately. Fresh paper, leather bindings, ink, polished wood. Books line shelf from floor to ceiling. Some cost enough to require careful saving. Others appeared in inexpensive serialized editions. Charles Dickens became famous partly because readers eagerly waited for each new installment of his novels. Imagine finishing one chapter, then waiting an entire month for the next. Modern audiences complain when streaming services release episodes weekly. Victorian readers mastered patience. They discussed theories, speculated about endings, argued politely, then patiently waited. Perhaps anticipation has always been part of enjoying stories. As the evening grows later, we find ourselves once more strolling through peaceful streets. Shop windows have gone dark. Railway platforms have emptied. The fairgrounds stand quiet beneath the moon. Only the occasional newspaper blows gently along the pavement. Looking back across the day's walk, we've wandered through bustling department stores, admired optimistic advertisements, visited cheerful fairs, encountered charming superstitions, boarded steam trains, peeked inside careful offices, watched photographers politely battle restless children, and browsed shelves filled with books waiting to transport readers somewhere else entirely. The remarkable thing is that none of these experiences seemed extraordinary to Victorians. They simply called it Saturday. History has a lovely habit of transforming ordinary weekends into fascinating museum exhibits. Perhaps one day, historians will patiently explain our supermarkets, our smartphones, our online shopping, our streaming services, and future listeners may quietly smile before falling asleep, wondering how anyone ever thought those things were perfectly normal, just as we wonder about Victorian England. In the next part of our slow journey, we'll explore the curious world of Victorian food, breakfast tables, dining customs, household routines, servants' daily lives, and why even preparing a simple meal required far more work than most of us would imagine today. Until then, the bakery finishes tomorrow's bread. The station clock marks another peaceful hour. The last shopkeeper blows out a lamp, and Victorian England drifts gently toward another quiet dawn, never suspecting that nearly 2 centuries later, someone far away will be listening to its ordinary stories while peacefully falling asleep. Morning arrives quietly in Victorian England, not with the sound of a smartphone alarm, not with the buzz of notifications, not with someone checking email before their feet even touch the floor. Instead, the day begins much more gently. A rooster somewhere outside believes himself to be personally responsible for sunrise. Church bells ring across the neighborhood. The first bakery wagons begin rolling through the streets. Coal deliveries clatter over cobblestones. Milkmaids make their rounds. The city slowly stretches awake. There is no rush, at least not by modern standards. The Victorians certainly worked hard, but the rhythm of life followed daylight. Church bells, factory whistles, and the dependable ticking of thousands of clocks. So settle in once more. Tonight, we'll spend an ordinary day inside a respectable Victorian household, discovering how everyday routines, which seemed completely ordinary at the time, now feel wonderfully distant. The first challenge of every morning wasn't deciding what to wear. It was making the house warm. Unless someone had kept the fire alive overnight, fireplaces needed to be rebuilt from scratch. Ashes removed, fresh coal added, kindling arranged carefully. Then came the patient business of persuading stubborn flames to cooperate. There was no thermostat waiting on the wall, no button to press. Warmth required work. During winter, servants often woke long before everyone else. By the time the family came downstairs, fireplaces were already glowing. Bedrooms had begun warming. Hot water had been prepared. Breakfast was underway. If you belonged to a household without servants, you did all of that yourself. Before breakfast, the Victorians had a remarkable ability to accomplish an enormous amount before 8 o'clock in the morning. Now, let's quietly walk into the kitchen. It is already alive with activity. The cook is tending several pots simultaneously. Bread is baking. Tea is steeping. Someone is chopping vegetables. Someone else is polishing copper pans until they gleam. The kitchen feels surprisingly warm compared to the rest of the house. Large cast iron ranges dominate the room. Cooking over them required real skill. Modern ovens politely maintain a chosen temperature. Victorian stoves had personalities. Some days they cooperated beautifully. Other days they behaved like slightly offended dragons. A good cook learned every mood, every hot spot, every cool corner. Experience mattered more than thermometers. Recipes often reflected this reality. Instead of saying, bake for 35 minutes at 350 degrees, a Victorian recipe might calmly suggest, bake in a good oven until properly done. Very helpful. Thank you. One imagines inexperienced cooks staring thoughtfully into the oven, wondering exactly when pie begins looking properly done. Experience supplied the answer. Usually. Now breakfast. Breakfast varied enormously depending upon wealth. Working families often ate simple meals. Bread, porridge, cheese, perhaps leftovers from the previous evening. Tea accompanied almost everything. Middle-class breakfasts became rather more impressive. Eggs, bacon, toast, jam, fish, porridge, fresh bread, tea, coffee, sometimes cold meats. And wealthier households occasionally served breakfasts that looked capable of feeding a small village. Victorian appetites could be surprisingly enthusiastic, especially among gentlemen convinced that hearty meals reflected strong character. One imagines doctors quietly nodding approval while someone's fourth slice of toast disappeared. Nutrition science still had a long journey ahead. After breakfast, everyone scattered toward different responsibilities. The father might leave for business. Children prepared for school. Servants cleaned relentlessly. The mother often supervised household management. Victorian homes required constant attention. Dust accumulated quickly. Coal soot found its way almost everywhere. Windows needed cleaning. Silver tarnished. Floors required sweeping. Laundry seemed to reproduce overnight. Keeping a respectable house was nearly a full-time occupation. Actually, it usually was. Let's spend a little time with the servants. History often focuses upon wealthy families. Yet Victorian Britain relied heavily upon domestic workers. For many young women, entering service offered one of the few opportunities to earn steady wages. A maid's day might begin before sunrise. She cleaned fireplaces, carried water, swept floors, made beds, polished furniture, answered doors, served meals, emptied chamber pots, cleaned boots, washed dishes, prepared bedrooms, locked the house, then repeated much of it tomorrow. It was demanding work, physically exhausting. Yet many servants developed lifelong friendships within households. Some remained with one family for decades. Children often grew up knowing the same nanny from infancy into adulthood. Butlers became trusted figures. Housekeepers practically governed enormous homes behind the scenes. Their authority below stairs sometimes rivaled the master's authority above them. A skilled housekeeper knew everything. Which cupboard contained the best china? How much coal remained? Which servant secretly admired another servant who had forgotten to polish the silver? Nothing escaped her notice. The smooth operation of a large Victorian house often depended upon one remarkably organized woman carrying an impressive collection of keys. Speaking of keys, Victorian houses contained many locks. Cupboards locked, cabinets locked, writing desks locked, tea caddies often locked. Yes, tea. Tea was valuable enough that households sometimes kept it secured. The lady of the house frequently controlled the tea supply personally. Considering Britain's enthusiasm for tea, this was rather like guarding a national treasure. Not because family members couldn't be trusted. Well, perhaps occasionally because family members couldn't entirely be trusted. A little extra tea had a mysterious habit of disappearing. History quietly suggests that temptation has always existed. Now let's visit wash day. If you've ever placed clothing into a washing machine, press one button and wandered away. The Victorians would likely regard this as astonishing luxury. Laundry was monumental. Water had to be heated, soap prepared, clothing scrubbed manually, rinsed repeatedly, wrung out by hand, hung outside whenever weather cooperated, ironed afterward using heavy irons heated directly on the stove. Imagine ironing an entire family's wardrobe while repeatedly returning the iron to fire because it kept cooling down. Suddenly modern laundry seems almost suspiciously convenient. Wash day consumed enormous amounts of energy. Entire households organized schedules around it. Some tasks simply couldn't happen simultaneously. Water remained precious. Fuel cost money. Time mattered. Nothing was wasted unnecessarily. Let's quietly step outside into the garden. Even modest homes often maintained small gardens. Flowers brightened narrow spaces. Vegetables supplemented household food. Herbs flavored meals. Children occasionally received tiny patches of earth to cultivate themselves. Gardening wasn't merely decorative. It was practical. Fruit trees provided harvests. Berry bushes rewarded patience. Cabbages quietly waited beneath morning dew. The Victorians admired productive gardens. Beauty and usefulness happily shared the same soil. Now the afternoon arrives. Lunch, usually called luncheon, tend to be lighter than dinner. Afterward, many middle-class ladies might visit friends. Paying social calls required careful etiquette. One never simply appeared unexpectedly at inconvenient hours. Visiting cards became essential. Small printed cards carried a person's name. Visitors left them when calling, even if no one happened to be home. The card itself quietly announced, "I was here." Entire rules develop around how cards should be delivered. Folded corners sometimes carried subtle meanings. Numbers written upon cards conveyed different messages. Victorians managed to transform tiny rectangles of paper into an entire communication system. They truly appreciated organized social interaction. Now, let us drift toward one of the most peaceful parts of the day, the afternoon tea. Not every family enjoyed elaborate afternoon teas with cakes and delicate sandwiches. But wherever possible, tea offered a welcome pause. Conversation slowed. The day's work briefly rested. Neighbors exchanged news. Children returned from school. The kettle, once again, became one of the busiest objects in Britain. If Victorian history had an unofficial mascot, it might honestly be a teapot. Reliable, comforting, always nearby. As evening approached, lamps required lighting. Before electricity spread widely, servants or family members moved from room to room lighting candles or gas lamps. Imagine doing this every single evening. One room, then another, then another. The entire house gradually glowed. Morning required extinguishing everything again. Darkness and light followed human effort. Electric switches would eventually feel miraculous. But for now, someone still carried the flame. Dinner remained the largest meal of the day. Conversation returned. News from work was shared. Letters were read aloud. Perhaps someone discussed the latest novel by Charles Dickens. Perhaps another family debated whether a new railway line would benefit the town. Children listened, sometimes politely, sometimes with minds already drifting toward tomorrow's adventures. After dinner came quieter pursuits. Needlework, reading, music, chess, writing letters, mending clothing, looking through family photograph albums, listening to someone practice piano with varying degrees of success. Every family possessed at least one enthusiastic musician, not always an accomplished one. Neighbors occasionally demonstrated heroic patience. Outside, the streets gradually emptied. Shopkeepers closed shutters. Factory whistles fell silent. The police continued their rounds. The last trains arrived at stations. The city exhaled. Bedrooms slowly filled with the soft glow of candles. Nightcaps, both the sleeping kind and sometimes a beverage, made appearances. Curtains were drawn. Prayers quietly spoken. Tomorrow would look remarkably similar, and there was comfort in that. Routine has always been one of humanity's gentlest companions. Looking back over today's peaceful journey, we've tended fireplaces before sunrise, prepared hearty breakfasts, worked alongside tireless servants, survived the weekly challenge of laundry, wandered through productive gardens, exchanged visiting cards, shared afternoon tea, lit evening lamps by hand, and settled into another quiet Victorian night. None of these routines were exciting. They weren't meant to be. They formed the steady rhythm of ordinary life, the heartbeat beneath history. When we think about the Victorian era, it's easy to picture grand palaces, famous writers, industrial inventions, and Queen Victoria herself. Yet most Victorians experienced none of those things directly. They experienced mornings, meals, chores, neighbors, weather, family conversations, the smell of fresh bread, the warmth of a fire, the comfort of familiar routines. In that way, their world doesn't seem quite so distant after all. In our next evening together, we'll continue exploring the wonderfully peculiar customs of Victorian England by visiting schools in greater detail, discovering leisure clubs, sports, newspapers, libraries, and the slow transformation of Britain into the modern world, all while the reassuring whistle of another steam train fades gently into the quiet night. The first light of dawn is only just beginning to soften the rooftops. London is waking slowly again. A thin ribbon of smoke curls upward from hundreds of chimneys. Somewhere nearby, a newspaper boy is already calling out the morning edition. A milk cart rattles gently over the cobblestones, while a sleepy cat stretches across the windowsill of a bakery that smells wonderfully of warm bread. It's another perfectly ordinary Victorian morning. And that is exactly what makes it so interesting, because ordinary days have a habit of becoming extraordinary once enough time has passed. So settle comfortably beneath your blanket. Take another slow breath. Tonight, we're going to spend our day learning, reading, playing, and quietly watching Victorian society discover what it meant to live in an increasingly modern world. For a Victorian child, school often began with one very important lesson. Sit still, not be creative, not express yourself, not even have fun. Simply sit still. Teachers valued order. Rows of desks stood perfectly aligned. Books rested neatly on polished wooden surfaces. Ink bottles waited patiently beside carefully trimmed pens. Blackboards filled with tidy handwriting overlooked classrooms where dozens of children attempted their very best not to fidget, which, as every generation has discovered, is quite a difficult task for children, especially when the weather outside looks inviting. Lessons usually began with reading, writing, arithmetic, scripture, history, geography. Children repeated facts aloud together. Entire classrooms echoed with synchronized recitation. The multiplication tables became almost musical. History dates, poetry, grammar rules, everything committed carefully to memory. Victorian education believed strongly in repetition. If you repeated something often enough, surely it would stay inside your head forever. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it escaped 5 minutes after the examination. Students, fortunately, have remained wonderfully consistent across the centuries. Handwriting mattered enormously. Beautiful penmanship reflected discipline. A page covered in elegant cursive suggested patience, education, and careful habits. Messy writing, well, teachers often regarded it as evidence that the students' thoughts themselves might also be untidy. Modern students who type everything may quietly sigh with relief. Victorian ink had a remarkable ability to end up absolutely everywhere except exactly where you intended. Fingers, sleeves, desks, occasionally noses. Ink possessed a curious sense of adventure. Now, let's quietly leave the classroom. School is finished for the afternoon. Children spill happily into the streets. Instantly, the remarkable discipline of the classroom disappears. Games begin. Laughter returns. Hoops roll down sidewalks. Skipping ropes slap rhythmically against the ground. Marbles clink together. Toy soldiers wage peaceful campaigns across dusty gardens. Girls organize elaborate games with dolls dressed in miniature Victorian fashions. Boys enthusiastically climb almost anything that looks climbable. Some habits seem to belong permanently to childhood. No century has successfully convinced children not to investigate interesting trees. Victorian parks soon fill with families. Nannies supervise energetic youngsters. Fathers remove stiff jackets and quietly become horses for imaginary carriages. Mothers spread blankets beneath shady trees. Picnics appear. Sandwiches, fruit, perhaps a small cake, if someone has remembered to pack one. Simple pleasures. Simple afternoons. History often feels grand because we remember kings and wars. Yet millions of ordinary people simply spent sunny afternoons watching children chase butterflies. Those moments matter too. Now let's wander into one of Victorian Britain's favorite institutions, the public library. The building feels wonderfully calm. Tall windows allow soft daylight to fall across long wooden tables. Shelves stretch almost to the ceiling. Everywhere there is accompanying smell of paper, leather, ink, dust, knowledge. Readers move quietly through the aisles. Some search for novels. Others study engineering. Some read newspapers from distant cities. Others investigate ancient history. Libraries represented something rather beautiful, the idea that knowledge should become increasingly available. Education slowly expanded beyond wealthy households. Working men attended evening lectures. Young women borrowed novels. Clerks studied mathematics after work. Factory workers learned foreign languages. Self-improvement became almost a national hobby. Victorian Britain genuinely believed that books could improve lives. Perhaps they still can. Now, let's quietly cross the street into a reading room. Here, newspapers from all across Britain lie carefully arranged upon long wooden racks. Men gather each morning to read the latest headlines. International politics, railway news, scientific discoveries, market prices, parliamentary debates, shipping reports, advertisements, weather forecasts, letters from readers. One newspaper might praise a new invention. Another criticizes it. One writer predicts a glorious future. Another warns that society is changing far too quickly. Again, some conversations never truly disappear. Only the inventions become newer. Reading the newspaper became an important daily ritual. Information traveled faster than ever before. Thanks to telegraph lines, news from Scotland could arrive in London with astonishing speed. Messages cross a country in minutes instead of days. To Victorians, this bordered on miraculous. Imagine explaining that information could travel through wires. Invisible, silent, almost instantly. It sounded remarkably futuristic, because it was. Let's continue our stroll toward a gentleman's club. Despite the rather exciting name, most clubs were wonderfully peaceful. Comfortable armchairs, large fireplaces, newspapers, chessboards, card tables. Conversation conducted in reassuringly calm voices. Members discussed politics, business, books, science. Occasionally, they simply enjoyed sitting quietly together. Some clubs specialized in literature. Others welcomed explorers. Scientists gathered elsewhere. Artists formed their own societies. Victorian Britain loved clubs. If several people shared an interest, sooner or later someone organized a committee, then elected officers, printed membership cards, established rules, held regular meetings. The Victorians possessed extraordinary organizational enthusiasm. One suspects they would have formed a society devoted entirely to forming societies. Across town, women also developed their own circles, literary societies, charitable organizations, music clubs, church groups, reading circles, tea gatherings. These provided friendship, education, and opportunities to participate more actively in community life. Many Victorian women quietly influenced society through charity work. They established schools, visited hospitals, organized relief for poor families, raised funds for libraries, improved local neighborhoods. History sometimes forgets these quieter contributions. Fortunately, they're becoming easier to recognize. Now, let's visit another place full of quiet excitement, the railway bookstall. Travelers waiting for trains browse shelves filled with inexpensive novels, adventure stories, travel guides, poetry, mysteries, maps, newspapers. The long railway journey creates a new opportunity. Reading while traveling. What seems completely ordinary today once felt delightfully modern. Entire publishing companies recognized this growing audience. Portable books became increasingly popular. A journey of several hours suddenly felt much shorter with a good story. Some passengers probably intended to admire the countryside. Instead, they became so absorbed in novels that they completely missed it. Readers have always been wonderfully talented at disappearing into books. Now, let's leave the station and head toward a cricket field. Victorian Britain loved sports. Cricket, rowing, tennis, croquet, archery, rugby. Football was still developing into the game we recognize today. Sports represented discipline, fairness, character, healthy competition. Cricket, in particular, became almost a symbol of proper conduct. Matches could last astonishingly long, entire afternoons, sometimes several days. Modern audiences occasionally complain when a movie lasts 3 hours. Victorian cricket politely asks, "What shall we do after lunch tomorrow?" Spectators brought picnic baskets. Families spread blankets. Friends chatted between overs. No one appeared especially rushed. Perhaps patience really was one of the century's greatest talents. Now the afternoon begins slipping gently toward evening. Church bells ring once more. Office workers finish their ledgers. School children return home. Factory whistles announce the end of another working day. Across Britain, millions of families begin settling into familiar routines. Some prepare dinner. Others tend gardens. Letters are written. Books are opened. Pianos begin practicing familiar melodies. A few unfortunate neighbors discover that someone's child has chosen tonight to begin learning the violin. History politely reminds us that every generation has endured beginner violin lessons. We are united by many things, among them questionable musical confidence. As darkness approaches, gas lamps gradually illuminate the streets again. Shopkeepers lower shutters. The newspaper boy has long since sold his final edition. Library doors close until morning. The reading room falls silent. Only the steady ticking of clocks continues. Time never seems hurried in Victorian England. It simply keeps moving. Patiently, reliably. Looking back across the day's peaceful journey, we spent time inside disciplined classrooms, played traditional children's games, visited libraries filled with eager readers, read newspapers carrying astonishingly modern debates, relaxed inside gentlemen's clubs, admired women's literary societies, browsed railway bookstalls, watched leisurely cricket matches, and witnessed another ordinary day quietly becoming history. Perhaps that's the greatest lesson Victorian England offers us. Progress isn't only made through spectacular inventions. It's also built through countless ordinary afternoons. A child learning to write neatly, a reader borrowing a library book, a family sharing a picnic, a volunteer organizing a charity meeting, a clerk reading the newspaper before work. History grows from millions of moments that hardly seem important while they're happening. Only later do they become the story. The years have drifted forward almost without us noticing. The children we met in the village school are now adults. The young clerk carefully practicing his handwriting has become a respectable manager. The little Christmas tree, that once seemed like a curious German tradition, now appears in homes all across Britain. Even London itself feels different. The city has grown. Railways stretch farther than ever. Factories continue to hum. New neighborhoods spread across the outskirts. The 19th century is quietly approaching its final years. Queen Victoria has now sat upon the throne for decades. Entire generations have known no other monarch. For many Britons, she seems almost as permanent as the Tower of London itself. It's difficult to imagine the country without her. And perhaps that's exactly why change can be so difficult to notice while you're living through it. It rarely arrives all at once. Instead, it knocks politely, then quietly moves the furniture 1 inch at a time. Imagine walking through London one evening in the 1880s. Something feels slightly different. The familiar glow of gas lamps still fills many streets. But here and there, you notice another kind of light. Electric light. At first, it seems almost unbelievable. No flame, no smoke, no one climbing a ladder each evening to light the lamps. Just steady, bright illumination. People gathered simply to stare at it. Some admired it. Some distrusted it. Others confidently declared that nothing would ever replace gaslighting. History enjoys introducing us to people who confidently predict the future. History also enjoys proving them spectacularly wrong. Electricity spread slowly. Only the wealthiest homes gain it at first. For everyone else, candles and gas continued doing their familiar work. The Victorians were practical people. They didn't abandon perfectly useful technology overnight. Old and new existed side by side. A horse-drawn carriage might roll past a building lit by electricity. A gentleman carrying the newest electric torch might still travel home behind a pair of horses. Progress seldom erases the past immediately. Instead, it politely shares a road for a while. Let's quietly step inside one of these newly electrified homes. Visitors can hardly hide their curiosity. They look upward at glowing bulbs. They ask cautious questions. Is it safe? Will it explode? Does it make the air unhealthy? Reasonable concerns. Really, every new invention appears slightly suspicious until it becomes ordinary. Imagine explaining Wi-Fi to a Victorian engineer. Invisible signals carrying conversations through the air. No wires. No smoke, no visible machinery. He might politely nod, then ask whether you've recently been spending time with those seance enthusiasts again. Technology and magic often look surprisingly similar when first introduced. Now, let's continue down the street. Something else is appearing everywhere. Bicycles. Not the peculiar high-wheeled bicycles with enormous front wheels that look like someone accidentally assembled them upside down. Those certainly existed. And yes, people actually rode them. One cannot help admiring their confidence. Imagine climbing onto something that places your head approximately level with a second-story window, then deciding to ride it over uneven Victorian roads. The phrase "good luck" suddenly feels entirely appropriate. Eventually, the safety bicycle arrived. It looked much more familiar. Two wheels of similar size, chain-driven, far easier to ride. The bicycle became one of the greatest freedoms ordinary people had ever known. Workers could travel farther. Families could visit neighboring towns. Young couples suddenly found pleasant excuses for long afternoon rides to the countryside. Entire cycling clubs appeared almost overnight. Naturally, the Victorians never met a hobby they couldn't organize into a club. Weekend cycling tours became fashionable. Ladies adopted slightly more practical clothing for riding. Gentlemen proudly compared bicycles with the same enthusiasm previous generations had reserved for horses. One wonders whether long debates soon developed. My bicycle is considerably faster than yours. Yes, but mine has superior handlebars. Some conversations simply change their equipment over time. The bicycle also quietly changed society in another important way. For many women, it offered unprecedented independence. Travel no longer depended entirely upon trains, horses, or family members. A bicycle represented personal freedom. Susan B. Anthony, the American women's rights advocate, would later describe the bicycle as having done more to emancipate women than almost anything else. A remarkably simple machine, a remarkably profound impact. Now let's wander into a photographer's studio once more. Photography has changed. Exposure times have become shorter. People no longer need to sit perfectly still for what feels like half an afternoon. Children remain difficult to photograph. Some traditions survive every technological improvement. Family portraits become increasingly common. Wedding photographs, holiday photographs, school photographs. The camera slowly enters ordinary life. Victorians begin documenting birthdays, pets, new houses, family reunions. The ordinary becomes worthy of preservation. Looking back now, we're grateful they did. Those photographs allow us to meet faces that would otherwise have disappeared completely into history. Sometimes a single photograph says more than 20 pages of written description. Now let's visit the growing suburbs. Victorian cities are expanding rapidly. Rows of brick houses stretch farther than ever before. Tree-lined streets appear. Small front gardens, neat hedges, bay windows. Families move away from crowded city centers whenever possible. Commuting becomes increasingly common thanks to expanding railways. A gentleman might work in central London, then return each evening to a quieter neighborhood several miles away. Sound familiar? Some aspect of modern life were already quietly taking shape. The suburbs represented a dream. Fresh air, space for children, a small garden, perhaps even enough room for a dog. Home ownership became an aspiration shared by many middle-class families. The perfect Victorian house wasn't enormous. It was respectable, comfortable, orderly, and naturally, spotlessly clean whenever visitors arrived. Now let's step into one of those homes on a rainy afternoon. Outside, rain taps gently against the windows. Inside, someone has brought out a board game. Victorian families love games. Chess, checkers, card games, word games, puzzle books, parlor games that encourage conversation. Some evenings included amateur theatricals. Entire families performed little plays in the sitting room. Imagine your uncle dramatically portraying Julius Caesar while your cousin forgets every line. The audience applauds anyway. Family entertainment has always involved generous encouragement. Music remains just as important. Pianos fill thousands of homes. Learning to play becomes an expected accomplishment, particularly among middle-class daughters. Not everyone becomes a concert pianist, fortunately. Otherwise, neighbors might never have experienced the uniquely educational sound of scales practiced every afternoon. Progress requires patience, especially from the family living next door. Let's quietly leave the house and visit one final marvel of late Victorian Britain, the museum. Museums become increasingly popular. Ordinary families spend weekends exploring collections. Dinosaurs, ancient Rome, Egyptian mummies, medieval armor, minerals, butterflies, steam engines, scientific instruments. The Victorians genuinely believed museums could educate while entertaining. Children wandered through enormous galleries with wide eyes. Adults read carefully written labels. Entire afternoons disappeared among fossils and paintings. Knowledge became something people enjoyed pursuing together. There's something wonderfully hopeful about that idea. Imagine a rainy Saturday. Instead of staying home, thousands of families voluntarily spend the day learning. Perhaps every generation underestimates how naturally curious people really are. As evening settles once more over Britain, let's pause for a moment. Queen Victoria is now elderly. The nation has changed beyond recognition. Since her coronation in 1837, railways connect the kingdom. Electricity begins replacing gas. Telephones carry voices across cities. Photography preserves memories. Bicycles race along country roads. Department stores fill with shoppers. Libraries welcome readers from every background. Children receive better education than many of their grandparents ever imagined. Yet despite all these astonishing changes, certain things remain exactly the same. The kettle still whistles. Families still gather around dinner tables. Neighbors still discuss the weather. Dogs still wait patiently by the front door. Children still invent games. People still write letters to those they love. Friends still laugh over cups of tea. History often celebrates dramatic revolutions. Real life usually changes much more gently, one ordinary day at a time. Looking back across today's journey, we've watched electricity quietly illuminate familiar rooms, followed cyclists along peaceful country roads, visited growing suburbs, captured family photographs, played board games beside rainy windows, explored magnificent museums, and witnessed an entire society stepping carefully into the modern world without ever realizing that future generations would call this period the end of an era, because to them, it was simply another Tuesday, another ordinary week, another familiar season beneath Queen Victoria's long and steady reign. The evening rain has finally stopped. The rooftops glisten beneath the moonlight, and little puddles reflect the warm glow of gas lamps. Somewhere in the distance, the final train of the night lets out a long, gentle whistle before disappearing into the darkness. A cat slips silently across a garden wall, apparently convinced it owns the entire neighborhood. To be fair, it probably does. The city feels peaceful now. The shops are closed. The streets are quiet. Inside thousands of Victorian homes, families have settled into familiar routines that have been repeated so many times they hardly require thought anymore. And perhaps that's where we should spend this evening. Not among inventions, not inside Parliament, not at the Crystal Palace, but inside the ordinary relationships that quietly shape Victorian life. Because history often remembers governments. People usually remember each other. Let's begin with friendship. Victorian friendships were often surprisingly formal by modern standards. Even close friends sometimes address one another by surname. Letters opened with wonderfully polite greetings. Visits followed careful etiquette. Appointments were arranged in advance whenever possible. Dropping by unexpectedly could place your host in an awkward position. Perhaps the sitting room wasn't tidy. Perhaps dinner wasn't ready. Perhaps someone was still wearing clothes intended only for family members. A respectable Victorian preferred to avoid such unfortunate surprises. Instead, visiting cards announced your intentions. A servant answered the door. Cards were exchanged. If the family happened to be unavailable, your card remained behind as quiet evidence of your thoughtfulness. It was rather elegant. Today our phones buzz constantly. Victorians managed social calendars using little pieces of printed cardboard. Both systems occasionally produce confusion. Only the materials changed. Friendships themselves often lasted decades. People wrote regularly, visited frequently, remembered birthdays, attended one another's weddings, helped during illness, supported families after bereavement. The Victorian world moved more slowly. Perhaps it gave relationships extra room to grow. Or perhaps every generation quietly believes friendships were somehow deeper in the past. History has a habit of making nostalgia look wonderfully convincing. Now let's wander toward one of the happiest occasions in Victorian life, a wedding. The church is decorated with flowers. Guests arrive wearing their finest clothes. Carriages line the road outside. Children whisper excitedly. Someone is almost certainly worrying about the weather. British weddings and British weather have maintained a fascinating relationship for centuries. The bride wears white. Interestingly, this tradition became enormously popular because of Queen Victoria herself. When she married Prince Albert in 1840, she chose a white satin gown. At the time, royal brides often wore silver or other rich colors. Victoria's choice captured the public imagination. Fashion magazines eagerly published illustrations. Soon brides across Britain wanted white dresses too. One royal decision quietly transformed wedding traditions around much of the world. It's remarkable how often history changes through imitation rather than legislation. Now imagine attending the reception afterward. There is music, tea naturally, cake, conversation, laughter kept politely within respectable limits. Victorian dancing differed from the energetic styles we know today. Waltzes, quadrilles, polkas, each dance followed recognizable patterns. Partners moved gracefully across polished wooden floors, while musicians played from one corner of the room. Learning to dance properly became an important social skill, not because everyone dreamed of becoming performers, because dancing offered respectable opportunities for young people to meet. Courtship itself followed careful customs. A young gentleman generally didn't stroll directly up to a lady and declare everlasting affection after 5 minutes of conversation. At least, not if he wished to be invited back. Introductions mattered. Family approval mattered. Reputation mattered enormously. Many conversations happened under careful supervision. A walk through the garden often included another relative somewhere comfortably nearby. Not too close, not too far, just enough to satisfy everyone's sense of propriety. Love certainly existed. Romance flourished. Poetry circulated. Flowers carried hidden messages. Letters filled with careful affection cross-country. The Victorians simply wrapped romance in several extra layers of etiquette. Perhaps they enjoyed the anticipation. There is something quietly charming about affection unfolding patiently instead of instantly. Now, let us visit a family celebrating a birthday. Interestingly, birthdays didn't always receive the grand celebrations many children enjoy today. Some families marked them modestly. Others barely acknowledged them beyond kind wishes. Large birthday parties gradually became more common as the century progressed. Children might receive books, simple toys, homemade treats, perhaps a favorite meal. The greatest gift often remained the gathering itself. Family around one table. Grandparents telling familiar stories. Brothers teasing sisters. Someone laughing just a little too loudly. Every family has always possessed at least one enthusiastic storyteller, usually convinced the same story somehow improves with every retelling. History gently suggests they are rarely discouraged. Now, let's quietly spend an afternoon with grandparents. Victorian families often lived surprisingly close together. Several generations frequently remained within the same town. Grandparents played important roles in raising children. They shared family history, old photographs, carefully preserved letters, stories from decades earlier. Imagine a grandfather describing life before railways reached his village. To a grandchild, it might sound almost unbelievable. No trains. How did anyone go anywhere? Slowly, patiently, usually behind a horse. Every generation eventually astonishes the next with descriptions of ordinary childhood. Now, let's wander into another familiar Victorian tradition. The Sunday afternoon. Sunday felt different. Church bells echoed across towns. Families dressed carefully. Church services gathered neighbors together. Afterward came leisurely walks, large dinners, quiet reading, conversation. Many businesses remained closed. The pace of life softened noticeably. For some families, Sunday became the only day everyone spent together. Industrial work schedules could be demanding. Sunday created breathing space. Modern weekends often disappear beneath errands. Victorian Sundays invited stillness. Sometimes perhaps a little too much stillness for energetic children. One imagines many youngsters politely enduring long sermons, while secretly wondering how much longer remained until dinner. Patience begins early. Now let's quietly step into a nursery once more. Bedtime has arrived. A mother reads from a storybook, perhaps one of the fairy tales becoming increasingly popular, perhaps a Bible story, perhaps a chapter from a beloved children's novel. The youngest child struggles heroically to keep tiny eyes open. The older sibling insists they are not sleepy, then falls asleep first. Some bedtime traditions appear wonderfully timeless. Candles are extinguished, curtains drawn, a kiss on the forehead, good night. The house gradually grows silent. Parents finally enjoy a few peaceful moments downstairs, until someone upstairs remembers they urgently require one more glass of water. History kindly informs us that children have always possessed impeccable timing. Now let us move toward one of the more emotional customs of Victorian family life, keeping family heirlooms. Victorians treasured objects connected with loved ones. Pocket watches passed from father to son. Wedding rings, handwritten recipe books, embroidered samplers, baby shoes carefully preserved, lockets containing tiny photographs, Bibles recording births, marriages, and deaths across generations. These objects quietly carried family memory, not because they were especially expensive, because they belonged to someone important. There is something deeply comforting about that. The value rested in the story, not the material. Now imagine an ordinary family gathering many years later. The children are grown. Some have married. Others have moved away. Yet they return home for holidays. The dining table fills once more. Old jokes return immediately. No explanation required. Everyone already knows the ending. Someone mentions an embarrassing story from childhood. The victim protests. Everyone laughs anyway. Families across every century appear remarkably committed to preserving one another's most awkward moments. It is practically a tradition. Now evening settles once again over Victorian England. The piano grows quiet. Letters are folded and sealed. A father winds a grandfather clock. A mother checks that every candle has been extinguished. Children sleep upstairs. Outside, the streets belong once again to watchmen, late travelers, and the occasional determined cat continuing its mysterious nightly business. Looking back over today's gentle journey, we've attended weddings inspired by Queen Victoria herself, observed careful courtship rituals, celebrated modest birthdays, spent peaceful Sundays with families, shared stories with grandparents, collected treasured heirlooms, watched children reluctantly go to bed, and discovered that beneath all the elaborate etiquette and formal manners, Victorian families were wonderfully familiar. They loved, they worried, they celebrated, they argued, they forgave, they laughed over old memories. They treasured photographs and letters because they knew time moved only in one direction. Perhaps that's why the Victorian age continues to feel so close despite the passing of nearly 2 centuries. The clothes have changed. The technology has changed. The streets have changed. But family life still follows many of the same gentle rhythms. Tomorrow's breakfast still needs preparing. Children still need encouragement. Friends still deserve letters. Grandparents still tell stories. And somewhere, another kettle quietly begins to boil. The morning begins long before the sun fully rises. A thin mist hangs over fields beyond the village. In London, chimney smoke is already climbing into the pale sky. In Manchester, factory whistles are only a few minutes away from announcing another working day. Along the docks in Liverpool, sailors are checking ropes that have become stiff with the cool night air. Across Britain, millions of people are waking up, not because an alarm clock buzzed on a bedside table, but because routine has quietly become part of who they are. For the Victorians, Work was more than simply earning a living. It was character, responsibility, identity. Ask someone what they did, and you learned almost everything society believed was important about them. So tonight, let's spend our time with the ordinary workers who quietly kept Victorian Britain moving. Not the famous inventors, not the celebrated politicians, not the great generals. Just ordinary people doing ordinary jobs extraordinarily well. Because history, despite all its kings and queens, has always rested on the shoulders of people who simply showed up to work every morning. As dawn spreads across the countryside, farmers are already awake. Their day doesn't begin with a clock. It begins with the weather. A cloudy sky means one thing. A clear sky means another. Rain changes everything. Harvest cannot wait simply because someone feels sleepy. Cows certainly don't postpone breakfast. Neither do chickens. The seasons still govern life just as they had for centuries. Even though railways now cross Britain, even though factories fill the cities, the countryside continued moving according to ancient rhythms. Spring brought planting. Summer demanded long hours. Autumn filled barns. Winter encouraged repair work by warm fires. The Industrial Revolution had changed Britain, but wheat remained wonderfully uninterested in industrial schedules. It grew when nature decided, not Parliament, not railway companies. Nature remained politely in charge. Now let's leave the fields behind and travel into one of Britain's growing industrial cities. The streets become busier. Smoke grows thicker. Brick buildings stand shoulder to shoulder. Factory chimneys rise above rooftops like enormous stone trees. Soon, the whistle sounds. Thousands of workers begin walking toward enormous mills. The sound echoes across the city. To modern ears, it might seem harsh. To Victorian workers, it simply meant another day had begun. Factory life varied enormously. Some workplaces were reasonably well managed. Others were exhausting. Textile mills filled with spinning machines. Iron foundries glowed with tremendous heat. Printing works produced newspapers and books. Breweries filled barrels destined for pubs across the country. Soap factories, glassworks, potteries, each possessed its own rhythm, its own sounds, its own familiar smells. Workers quickly learned to recognize their factory with their eyes closed. The sound alone was enough. Imagine entering a textile mill. Hundreds of machines spin continuously. Belts turn overhead. Threads stretch across enormous rooms. The air carries tiny fibers that dance in shafts of sunlight. Conversation becomes difficult. The machines simply speak too loudly. Yet somehow, workers become accustomed to it. Human beings possess an extraordinary ability to adapt. After several years, silence itself might even seem strange. Now, let's quietly step away from the factories and into a much smaller workshop. A carpenter is already busy. The smell of freshly cut oak fills the room, with shavings curled gently onto the floor. Every shelf holds carefully arranged tools. Hand planes, chisels, mallets, saws polished by years of use. Nothing here moves quickly. Every cut matters. Every measurement counts. Victorian craftsmen took enormous pride in their work. Furniture wasn't expected to last 5 years. It was expected to outlive its owner, perhaps even become part of the next generation's home. A dining table built in 1870 might still serve family dinners 50 years later. A well-made chair deserved respect, not because it was fashionable, because it was dependable. Victorians admired dependable things, dependable furniture, dependable neighbors, dependable trains. Well, most of the time. Railways occasionally had other ideas. Let's wander next door. A tailor sits beside a large window where daylight helps him work. His measuring tape hangs comfortably around his neck. Pins rest neatly in a small cushion. Every suit begins as flat pieces of cloth. Slowly, patiently, almost magically, a jacket begins taking shape. Ready-made clothing is becoming increasingly common, but custom tailoring remains highly respected. A well-fitted suit quietly announces that its owner values appearance. Victorian society noticed such things quite carefully. Across the street, the village blacksmith is already at work. The rhythmic ringing of hammer against iron echoes through the morning. Children pause to watch. Horses wait patiently to receive new shoes. Farm tools require repair. Wagon wheels need strengthening. The blacksmith occupies an important place in village life. Strong, reliable, usually covered in just enough soot to suggest an honest day's work. There is something timeless about a forge. Fire, iron, skill, three ingredients that remain remarkably unchanged for centuries. Now let's continue toward the marketplace. This is where Victorian Britain truly comes alive. Farmers unload fresh vegetables. Fishmongers arrange today's catch upon beds of ice. Florists prepare colorful displays. Cheesemakers proudly present enormous wheels of cheddar. Bakers fill the air with irresistible aromas. Customers stroll slowly between stalls. Nobody seems particularly rushed. Shopping still involves conversation. The baker asks about your family. The butcher recommends a better cut for Sunday's dinner. The greengrocer quietly mentions that apples are especially good this week. Every purchase strengthens relationships as much as it fills cupboards. There is a pleasant familiarity here. Most customers already know one another. Children wave. Neighbors stop for conversation. Someone inevitably discusses the weather. Britain has maintained a loyal relationship with weather discussions for centuries, perhaps because the weather itself enjoys surprising everyone equally. Now, let's visit the local post office. It isn't merely a place for letters. It has become the nervous system of Victorian communication. People collect parcels, purchase stamps, receive money orders, ask about deliveries. The postmaster knows nearly everyone. He rarely intends to become the center of village information. It simply happens naturally. Letters continue arriving several times each day. Imagine that. Multiple postal deliveries. In some London neighborhoods, letters arrive so frequently that friends could exchange several messages within one day. Victorian texting, only with considerably better handwriting. Now let us spend some time inside a railway station. Steam drifts lazily upward. Porters push heavy luggage carts across the platform. Conductors check tickets with practiced efficiency. The station master stands proudly in his carefully pressed uniform. Railway workers become respected professionals. Everything depends upon precision. Signals, schedules, switches, safety. A train arriving 5 minutes late becomes worthy of discussion. Victorian Britain valued punctuality almost as much as it valued tea, perhaps slightly less. Tea remained difficult to surpass. Nearby, a telegraph operator quietly taps messages across hundreds of miles. Click, 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 pause, click. Invisible information races through wires faster than any horse could ever travel. It still feels miraculous. To us, it resembles early technology. To the Victorians, it bordered on science fiction. Let's quietly leave the station and visit another familiar profession, the schoolteacher. Teaching in Victorian Britain demanded patience. Children arrived carrying different abilities, different personalities, different dreams. Some would become lawyers, some farmers, some factory workers, some shopkeepers. The teacher could not possibly know which child would one day change the world. So each received the same careful lessons: reading, writing, arithmetic, history, geography, good manners, discipline. Many teachers became deeply respected figures within their communities. Former students often remembered them for decades, sometimes with affection, sometimes with slight nervousness, usually both. Now evening begins approaching. Workers leave factories. Carpenters sweep workshops. Shopkeepers count the day's earnings. Teachers lock classroom doors. The blacksmith allows the forge to cool. The baker already begins preparing tomorrow's bread. Work ends. Routine continues. Families gather once more. Boots are removed. Hands are washed. The day's stories are exchanged over dinner. A father describes a busy morning at the railway. A mother laughs about an unexpected visitor. Children proudly announce excellent handwriting, or perhaps conveniently avoid mentioning mathematics altogether. Every household develops its own familiar rhythm. Outside, lamps are lit one by one. The marketplace grows quieter. Only a few late customers remain. The village settles. The city softens. Britain exhales after another ordinary working day. Looking back across today's journey, we followed farmers through quiet fields, factory workers through great industrial buildings, carpenters shaping oak into furniture, tailors stitching elegant suits, blacksmiths forging iron beside glowing fires, shopkeepers greeting familiar customers, teachers guiding curious children, railway workers connecting an entire nation, and postal workers carrying countless letters from one family to another. None of these people expected history books to remember their names. Most of them never appeared in newspapers. Yet without them, Victorian Britain simply could not have existed. Empires are often described through maps. Perhaps they should sometimes be described through occupations instead, because every bridge required builders. Every letter required a postman. Every loaf required a baker. Every train required engineers. Every child required a teacher. History, in the end, is less about extraordinary individuals than it is about millions of ordinary people quietly doing their jobs with care. And as another peaceful evening settles across Queen Victoria's Britain, fireplaces glow warmly behind curtained windows. The last customers leave the marketplace. A distant train whistles into the darkness. Tomorrow morning, before the sun fully rises, the entire beautiful rhythm will begin again. The evening feels different tonight. Not dramatically different. History almost never changes with a great clap of thunder. Instead, it changes the way the seasons do. One morning, you notice the leaves have begun turning gold. Another morning, you realize the air has become just a little colder. Only much later do you understand that summer quietly slipped away. That is how the Victorian age approaches its final chapter. No one living through it wakes up and says, "Today an era is ending." They simply button their coats, pour another cup of tea, catch the morning train, write another letter, light another fire. Life continues, exactly as it always has. Yet beneath those familiar routines, Britain is changing once again. And tonight, we'll slowly watch one remarkable age prepare to hand the world to another. By the closing years of the 19th century, Queen Victoria has become more than simply a monarch. She has become a symbol. Entire generations have never known another sovereign. Children who celebrated her golden jubilee are now parents themselves. Grandparents remember hearing stories about her coronation. For many people, she seems almost timeless. The newspapers no longer describe her as a young queen. Instead, they speak with quiet respect. The Queen. Everyone knows exactly who that means. Her image appears in schools, government offices, coins, postage stamps, family albums. Across Britain and across the empire, her face has become almost as familiar as the rising sun. Yet age reaches everyone, even queens. Victoria's once dark hair has long since turned white. Her steps have become slower. Public appearances require more effort. She continues carrying enormous responsibility. But the years leave gentle reminders upon every face. There is something deeply human about that. History often presents famous people as though they were carved from marble. They were not. They grew older. They became tired. They missed loved ones. They laughed. They worried. They caught colds. They waited for letters. Queen Victoria did all those things. She simply happened to do them while ruling one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. Now let's quietly stroll through London one last time. It is still unmistakably Victorian. Horse-drawn buses continue along busy streets. Gentlemen still carry polished walking sticks. Ladies still wear elegant hats decorated with feathers and ribbons. Children still race through parks with hoops and skipping ropes. Yet everywhere you look, the future quietly peeks through. Electric tram cars begin appearing. Motor cars make occasional appearances, usually accompanied by curious crowds. People stop to stare. Some smile, some shake their heads. A few confidently announce that noisy automobiles will never replace dependable horses. The horses, meanwhile, continue their work with complete professionalism. History enjoys these little moments. Old certainty meeting new possibility. Neither fully understand the other. Let's visit one of London's busiest streets. Department store windows grow larger each year. Bright electric lights illuminate evening displays. Shoppers linger after sunset because they finally can. The city itself seems to remain awake a little longer. Restaurants stay open. Theaters welcome evening audiences beneath glowing signs. Night gradually becomes less dependent upon candles. A simple invention quietly stretches the length of the day. It feels almost magical. Imagine explaining to someone born in 1800 that one day entire streets would shine without a single gas flame. Progress often arrives looking impossible, then slowly becomes ordinary. Now let's step inside an ordinary middle-class home. The family gathers after dinner. Grandfather sits comfortably beside the fireplace. His grandchildren ask questions about the old days. To them, the early Victorian years already sound ancient. Grandfather smiles. He remembers traveling by stagecoach. He remembers when the railway first reached the town. He remembers the excitement of seeing his first photograph. He remembers when letters took much longer to arrive. The children listen with wide eyes. Really? There were no telephones? No electric lights? No bicycles? Grandfather laughed softly. No, there weren't. Every generation eventually becomes someone else's history lesson. One day, today's children will tell stories beginning with, "When I was your age." The cycle quietly continues. Now let us leave the house and wander into one of Britain's great museums. Visitors continue arriving in steady streams. School children admire dinosaur skeletons. Families pause before Egyptian statues. Artists quietly sketch ancient sculptures. Scientists carefully examine newly discovered fossils. The Victorians leave behind something extraordinary, not simply railways, not only factories, but institutions, libraries, museums, universities, public parks, hospitals, schools, buildings created not merely for one generation, but for many. That may be one of the quietest forms of optimism. Building something you know you may never fully enjoy yourself. Trusting strangers in the future to continue the work. History is remarkably generous when viewed that way. Each generation quietly prepares the road for the next. Now let's visit the countryside once more. At first glance, very little has changed. Stone cottages remain. Church bells still echo across green fields. Farmers continue watching the weather with the same careful attention their grandparents gave it. The seasons remain wonderfully uninterested in politics. Spring still arrives. Autumn still paints the trees. Winter still encourages families to gather around warm fires. Nature politely continues regardless of history books. Perhaps that is comforting. No matter how quickly inventions appear, birds continue building nests. Rain continues watering gardens. The moon continues rising over quiet villages. Some rhythms are older than civilization itself. Now evening begins falling. The 20th century waits just beyond the horizon. Most people hardly think about it. There's washing to finish, letters to answer, children to tuck into bed, shoes to polish for tomorrow. History's greatest transitions often occur while someone is peeling potatoes. Ordinary life never pauses simply because historians will later give a period a memorable name. Then comes a moment that quietly touches the hearts of many Britons. The year is 1901. Queen Victoria dies after a reign lasting nearly 64 years. Across Britain, church bells toll. Shops close. Black mourning clothes appear once again. People gather silently in streets. Some cry openly. Others simply remove their hats. For many, it feels impossible. She had always been there. The queen, who seemed permanent, is suddenly gone. An era receives its name almost immediately. The Victorian Age. Not because people planned it, because they suddenly realize it has ended. King Edward VII now ascends the throne. New fashions begin appearing. Music changes. Technology accelerates. Society gradually becomes less formal. The Edwardian era quietly begins. Yet the Victorians leave behind far more than old photographs and elegant buildings. They leave habits, ideas, institutions, traditions. Many remain part of everyday life even now. Afternoon tea, Christmas trees, public libraries, department stores, modern policing, improved sanitation, photography as family memory, public museums, public parks, railway commuting, Even the expectation that children deserve education. Their fingerprints remain everywhere. Sometimes we simply stop noticing them because they have become normal. Looking back across this evening, we've watched an extraordinary century gently prepare for its farewell. We've seen an elderly queen become a national grandmother. We've watched electricity replace candlelight. We've listened to grandparents describe vanished worlds. We've walked through museums built for future generations. We've stood quietly beside people saying goodbye to a monarch who had shaped almost an entire lifetime. Nothing ended suddenly. Nothing vanished overnight. The Victorian age simply folded itself carefully into history, much like a well-loved letter placed gently inside a family Bible. Not forgotten, simply preserved. And tomorrow evening, in our final chapter, we'll return one last time to the quiet streets of Victorian England. We'll walk together through everything we've experienced, from smoky London mornings and peaceful countryside evenings to Christmas trees, railway stations, family dinners, libraries, workshops, gardens, and afternoon tea. We'll gather every gentle memory from our journey into one peaceful reflection before saying a calm good night to one of history's most remarkable centuries. Our long walk is almost complete. Just one more quiet evening remains. The night is wonderfully quiet now. The fog has settled softly over the rooftops. The final train has already disappeared into the darkness, leaving only a faint memory of steam drifting beneath the moonlight. Somewhere in the distance, a church clock quietly announces another hour. A cat makes one final inspection of a garden wall. A bakery has already begun preparing tomorrow morning's bread. And inside thousands of Victorian homes, the candles have been extinguished. The fireplaces glow gently with their last remaining embers. Families have gone to sleep. The great city itself seems to breathe more slowly. If you've been with me from the beginning of this journey, we've wandered together for many peaceful evenings through a world that no longer exists, yet somehow never completely disappeared. So tonight, let's take one final walk. Not to discover something new, but simply to remember, when we first arrived in Victorian England, we probably expected a world that felt impossibly distant. A world of corsets, top hats, horse-drawn carriages, gas lamps, strict etiquette, complicated rules. And yes, all of those things were certainly there. But something rather unexpected happened along the way. The more closely we looked, the more familiar everything became. The people weren't museum exhibits. They weren't characters trapped inside old photographs. They were simply people. People who woke up a little reluctantly on cold mornings. People who worried whether it might rain before the washing dried. People who hurried to catch trains. People who forgot birthdays and then desperately tried to remember them at the last moment. Some things truly never change. We watched fireplaces being lit before sunrise. An ordinary task, repeated every morning, without anyone imagining that future generations would someday warm entire houses simply by turning a small dial on a wall. We watched cooks preparing breakfast over cast-iron ranges that required patience instead of electricity. The smell of fresh bread filled kitchens exactly as it still does today. Children still complained when vegetables appeared. Parents still encouraged them to eat anyway. History quietly smiles at these little moments, because across centuries, families remain wonderfully familiar. We spent long afternoons wandering through department stores where shopping itself had become entertainment. Bright windows tempted customers with elegant displays. Advertisements confidently promised impossible improvements. A certain soap would surely transform your life. A miraculous tonic would restore youthful energy. A remarkable umbrella apparently possessed nearly supernatural abilities. Advertising has always been wonderfully optimistic, sometimes a little too optimistic. We smiled at those cheerful promises because we recognized them. Today's advertisements simply arrive through different screens. We visited libraries where readers disappeared into novels while rain tapped softly against tall windows. Books waited patiently upon shelves. Knowledge became something ordinary people could pursue after work. Entire evenings disappeared in side stories. Perhaps the greatest compliment anyone can pay a book is forgetting what time it is while reading it. Victorian readers certainly understood that feeling. We walked through schools filled with carefully arranged desks. Children practiced handwriting with remarkable determination. Ink somehow reached fingers, sleeves, and occasionally noses. Teachers patiently repeated multiplication tables until they became almost musical. Outside the classroom, those same children immediately transformed into adventurous explorers climbing trees, racing hoops, and inventing games that required almost no equipment at all. Childhood has always been remarkably inventive. Give children expensive toys. They may prefer the cardboard box. History quietly confirms this timeless truth. We sat beside afternoon tea, perhaps the most comforting ritual of the entire Victorian age. The kettle sang. Tea was poured. Conversation slowed. For just a little while, the world became smaller, softer, kinder. There is something quietly beautiful about traditions built around simply sitting together. No urgency, no great achievement, just company. Sometimes that is enough. We celebrated Christmas beneath freshly decorated evergreen trees. Candles flickered carefully among the branches. Children waited patiently, or at least, as patiently as excited children have ever managed. Families exchanged thoughtful gifts. Neighbors visited one another. Church bells echoed through snowy streets. Many of those traditions still brighten homes today. The Victorians would probably recognize our Christmases far more easily than we imagine. We explored marketplaces where every shopkeeper knew their customers. The baker asked about your mother. The butcher recommended tomorrow's roast. The florist quietly suggested flowers for someone's anniversary. Buying groceries also meant maintaining friendships. Commerce and conversation comfortably shared the same counter. Perhaps online shopping saves time. But one wonders if it occasionally misses those gentle little conversations that quietly stitch communities together. We visited photographers, asking everyone to remain perfectly still, which, naturally, proved almost impossible whenever small children became involved. We laughed gently at hidden mothers disguised beneath blankets while secretly holding babies upright for portraits. The photographs survive. The blankets thankfully do not. Technology solved that little problem. Eventually, we admired bicycles rolling along peaceful country roads, machines that quietly transformed freedom itself. Young women gained independence. Workers traveled farther. Families explored the countryside together. Sometimes history changes because of speeches. Sometimes it changes because someone invents a better bicycle. The simplest ideas occasionally travel the farthest. We wandered through museums filled with fossils, paintings, steam engines, and Egyptian statues. The Victorians believed knowledge belonged to everyone, not just professors, not only wealthy collectors. Everyone. There is something deeply hopeful in building museums for strangers you will never meet. Perhaps civilization quietly depends upon that kind of generosity, doing something today that mainly benefits tomorrow. We spent evenings listening to amateur piano performances, some beautifully accomplished. Others performed with tremendous enthusiasm. Neighbors across Britain demonstrated extraordinary patience. Progress in music has always required forgiving audiences. We met servants who rose before sunrise to warm houses for families still asleep. We followed blacksmiths shaping glowing iron, teachers patiently guiding classrooms, railway workers connecting entire cities, postmen carrying countless letters, farmers trusting the weather more than forecasts, carpenters building tables intended to last a lifetime. None expected statues. Most never appeared in newspapers. Yet without them, Victorian Britain simply would not have existed. History often celebrates remarkable individuals. Real history belongs equally to ordinary people quietly doing ordinary work with extraordinary care. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson this journey has offered us. History isn't only made inside palaces. It is also made inside kitchens, libraries, gardens, schoolrooms, workshops, railway stations, dining rooms, and quiet little cottages where nobody imagines future generations will ever wonder how they lived. Toward the end of our journey, we watched Queen Victoria herself grow older. The young queen became a grandmother, then an elderly monarch. Entire generations knew no other ruler. When she died in 1901, it felt less like losing a politician and more like saying goodbye to a familiar landmark that had always been part of the landscape. The Victorian age quietly folded itself closed. The Edwardian era began. Automobiles slowly replaced horses. Electricity gradually replaced candles. Telephones carried voices farther than letters ever could. Yet despite all those astonishing changes, something important remained. People still loved their families, still worried about tomorrow, still celebrated birthdays, still gathered around dinner tables, still treasured old photographs, still kept recipes passed down from grandparents, still wrote letters to friends, eventually emails, eventually text messages. The method changed. The feeling never did. That may be why history feels comforting instead of distant. The details change. Human nature rarely does. As we stand here one final time beneath the quiet Victorian sky, the city has almost completely fallen asleep. The last gas lamp flickers gently beside an empty street. A railway porter finishes his shift. The baker quietly closes the oven door after preparing tomorrow's first loaves. Somewhere, a grandfather winds a family clock one final time before bed. A mother gently checks on sleeping children. A father places another piece of coal onto the fading fire. Outside, snow begins falling so softly that almost nobody notices. Tomorrow will arrive exactly as yesterday did. The kettle will boil. The newspaper boy will call through the streets. Shopkeepers will unlock their doors. School children will reluctantly gather their books. Steam trains will whistle across the countryside. Afternoon tea will pause another busy day. Neighbors will exchange quiet conversations over garden fences. Someone will write a letter. Someone will receive one. Someone will begin reading a new novel by the fire. Someone will finish an old one. Life will continue. Ordinary, peaceful, entirely unaware that more than a century later, people around the world would find comfort simply listening to these ordinary moments again. Perhaps that's the quiet magic of history. The grand events are important. Kings, queens, wars, inventions, empires. But when the noise finally fades away, what remains are the ordinary days. Breakfast shared with family, a walk through familiar streets, a warm cup of tea, children laughing in a garden, friends talking beside a fire, a letter written with care, a photograph carefully placed inside an album, the smell of fresh bread before sunrise, the reassuring sound of train disappearing into the night. Those small moments become the true memory of every age. And now, our long walk through Victorian England has reached its gentle end. The fireplaces have burned low. The clocks continue their patient ticking. The city sleeps beneath a blanket of quiet fog. If your eyes have grown heavy during our journey, then perhaps we've experienced Victorian England exactly as it deserves to be remembered, not as a frantic collection of dates, not as a noisy list of inventions, but as a calm, living world full of ordinary people doing their best beneath the soft glow of gas lamps and the steady passage of time. So, wherever you are tonight, thank you for joining me on this slow walk through one of history's most fascinating centuries. Dim the lights, pull the blanket a little closer, let the last whistle of the steam train fade into the distance, and allow Victorian England, its quiet streets, warm kitchens, peaceful gardens, gentle conversations, and endless cups of tea, to drift softly into your dreams. Good night, sleep well, and until our next journey through history, may your own tomorrow begin just as gently as theirs once did.